Before sky, before earth, before gods, there is only water. And in the beginning it was a goddess. Her name was Tiamat, the primordial saltwater sea. To create the world, a younger god murdered her, splitting her corpse into heaven and earth. The first act of creation was an act of violence against a water deity. This was not an accident. A civilization thrives for 3 millennia because a goddess weeps. A sky is repaired by a serpent-bodied creator after a water god's rage. Children are sacrificed so their tears might summon rain. A river is not a resource, but a mother whose water cleanses sin. Why, across 10,000 years and every continent, was water so often given a female face? Why was the source of all life so consistently imagined as a living, divine being that could be worshipped, mourned, and violated? This is not a story about myth. It is a story about power, ecology, and what we chose to protect when we saw the divine in the water. And what happened when we killed her? The world was born from the body of a water goddess. We have been living in her corpse ever since. Before there were gods with names, before there were temples, before there were even words to write down prayers, there was the sound of water. It was the first sound, the drip from a limestone cave ceiling into a still, dark pool. The gurgle of a spring pushing up through gravel and sand. The distant, constant murmur of a river carving its path through a dry land. For the first human beings walking out of Africa, water was not a resource. It was a miracle. It was life emerging from stone, from sand, from the deep, unknowable earth. It was the only thing that stood between the community and oblivion. And so, long before history began, before kings and empires, humanity's first act of reverence was not directed toward the sun or the storm, but toward this. Toward the source. This is where our story begins, not with epic battles in the heavens, but with a quiet, daily wonder. With the simple, staggering fact of a spring in a dry place. For tens of thousands of years, human memory was oral, temporary as a footprint in mud. Our only window into those first spiritual thoughts is the silent testimony of objects left behind, buried in the very earth that cradled the water. And in the rolling hills of what is now Jordan, a window was opened. At a place called Ain Ghazal, the spring of the gazelle, archaeologists in the 1980s made a discovery that would push back the horizon of our understanding. They unearthed a cache of statues, but not like any seen before. These figures, crafted around 700 years before the Common Era, are made of plaster molded over bundles of reeds. They are life-sized, some with 2 heads, but it is their faces that arrest you. Their eyes are wide, staring, outlined in dark, tarry bitumen. They see nothing and everything. They were buried carefully in pits near what were almost certainly spring sites. They are not portraits of the dead, nor are they idols in a later sense. Scholars like Gary Rolifson, who led the excavations, believe they represent something else entirely. They are embodiments of presence. Perhaps they were guardians of the water source itself, physical manifestations of the spirit of the spring. They tell us that by the Neolithic period, 7 millennia before Christ, the act of drawing water had already become a ritual. The source was not just a geographical feature, it was a being, worthy of representation, of offering, of respect. This is the oldest evidence we have of water worship. It predates writing by over 5,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Egypt by more time than separates us from the pyramids. The first gods were not in the sky. They were in the ground, and they were wet. This reverence took root across the cradle of civilization, the arc of land known as the Fertile Crescent. And when writing finally did emerge, around 3400 BCE in the mud brick cities of Sumer, It captured a theological reality that was already ancient. The first named divinities associated with water, inscribed in the world's oldest written language, cuneiform, were overwhelmingly, decisively female. Consider Nama. Her name in the wedge-shaped script is written with a sign that means the primordial sea. She is not a goddess who controls water. She is the water. In texts recovered from the sacred city of Ur, she is described as the mother who gave birth to heaven and earth. She is the primeval womb, the dark, watery chaos from which all order emerged. She predates the later, more famous male gods of storm and sky, Enlil, Marduk, Zeus, by centuries in the written record. She is the foundation, the source. Before a father god ruled the heavens, a mother sea gave birth to existence itself. This pattern is not a literary coincidence. It is etched into the very landscape where civilization began. Look at the earliest Neolithic settlements in the Zagros Mountains and along the nascent floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates. Communities did not build their homes just near water. They oriented their entire world toward it. Archaeologists have mapped villages where house entrances consistently face the spring or the creek. The water source was the focal point, the front door of the community. And who was it that went to that door day after day, generation after generation? Ethnobotanical studies, analyzing plant remains and tools, combined with burial evidence, strongly suggest that in these early agrarian societies, water gathering was primarily the work of women. It was they who walked the paths to the spring with clay jars balanced on their heads or hips. It was they who knew the water's taste, its seasonal changes, its moods. It follows, then, that they became the first ritual keepers of these sites. The act of drawing water blurred into an act of communion. A small offering left by the bank, a pebble, a shell, a crudely shaped figurine, was a gesture of thanks, a plea for continuity. This pattern appears independently, like a spiritual instinct, across early Anatolia, the Levant, and the Nile Delta. The protection and veneration of the water source was likely a domestic, feminine-led practice long before it was formalized by temple priests. The theology grew from the daily rhythm of survival, from the hands that carried the lifeblood of the community. This deep-seated association between water and the feminine is woven into the very fabric of human language. It is not arbitrary. In virtually every early language family, Proto-Semitic, Proto-Indo-European, early Dravidian, the root words for water, river, and sea carry feminine grammatical gender. In Sanskrit, upper waters is feminine. In ancient Egyptian, the word for Nile flood, hapi, is an exception that proves the rule, but the concept of the inundation is tied to the goddess Isis. In Greek, thalassa, sea, is feminine. In Latin, aqua is feminine. Linguists like Steven Pinker and cognitive archaeologists argue this reflects a profound, pre-linguistic cognitive reality. The cultures that built these languages did not assign gender randomly. They perceived water as inherently generative, cyclical, nourishing, and mysterious, qualities they associated with the feminine principle. The grammar preserved an ancient understanding. Water was a mother. This cognitive thread may lead us back even further, into the deep shadows of the Paleolithic. For over a century, the so-called Venus figurines, the rounded, stylized female forms like the one from Willendorf, have been debated as symbols of fertility. But a newer body of scholarship, pioneered by Marija Gimbutas and expanded by subsequent researchers, suggests a more specific connection. Many of these figurines, like the famous Venus of Laussel holding a crescent-shaped horn, were discovered in cave sites near underground water sources, springs, or ancient riverbanks. The horn, Gimbutas argued, is not a drinking horn, but a symbol of the moon, which pulls the tides. The association is not merely with fertility in a human sense, but with the fertile, life-giving power of the natural world centered on water. The figurines may be the earliest physical expressions of a divine force that is both feminine and aquatic. They are not dolls. They are perhaps the first icons of the sacred source, carved by Ice Age hunters who understood that the survival of the herd and the tribe depended on the secret water places. By the time the first true cities rose from the Mesopotamian mud around 3500 BCE, this water theology was already immeasurably old. The urban revolution did not create it, it inherited it and began to transform it. Consider Eridu. Sumerian king lists proclaim it the first city ever built, a place of immense antiquity even to the ancient Sumerians. And where was it founded? Not on a defensible hill, but on a freshwater marsh at the edge of the Persian Gulf. Its patron deity was Enki, the clever god of wisdom, magic and fresh water. Enki is male, a sign of the shifting theological landscape where authority and control were becoming masculine attributes. But the stories could not erase the older foundation. Enki's consort, and more importantly his mother, was the ocean goddess Nama. She is the one who petitions him to create humans to relieve the younger gods of labor. Even in this new, urban, male-centered pantheon, the creative primordial power is still feminine and aquatic. The masculine god administers the water from his temple, Abzu, his watery shrine. But the feminine sea remains his origin, his source of power. The architecture of belief had changed, but its deepest cornerstone was still the first water. We can see this transition frozen in clay. A cuneiform tablet from Nippur, inscribed with a composition scholars call the Eridu Genesis, tells of the creation of the world and a great flood. The text is fragmentary, but its opening lines are resonant. It speaks of a time when the world was all sea, a direct echo of Nama's primordial realm. The tablet itself is a physical bridge between the ancient, feminine water chaos and the newer, structured world of cities and kings. The story of water, then, begins not with domination, but with dependence. Not with a sovereign decree from the clouds, but with a whispered thanks at a spring. The first divine relationships were intimate, local, and maternal. They were born from the daily, vital journey to the water's edge, a journey made most often by women. This foundational layer of belief, water as a living, feminine, sacred presence, formed the bedrock upon which all later mythologies would be built. It was a theology of gratitude and reciprocity. But a profound shift was on the horizon. The quiet veneration of the spring would soon be drowned out by the thunder of a different kind of story. As cities grew and empires clashed, the water would no longer be just a mother. It would become an opponent, a monster, a prize to be conquered in a cosmic war. The primordial sea, Nama, would give way to another, more fearsome embodiment of the deep, Tiamat. And the battle for creation would begin not with love, but with a rebellion. The first water had been worshipped. The first war over water was about to be fought. Before there was a world, there was water. Before there was a name for anything, there was a depth. It was not empty. It was not silent. It was a living darkness, a churning, formless potential. This is where the oldest story we have written down begins. Not with a word, but with a mingling. Not with a command, but with a union. In the beginning, there were two, and they were both water. They are the first parents of everything that will ever be. Their names are Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu is the sweet water, the freshwater ocean that flows beneath the earth. Tiamat is the salt water, the bitter sea that stretches beyond all knowing. In the oldest Babylonian texts, they are not yet gods as we would understand them. They are the substance of the universe itself. They are the matter before matter. They are the chaos that contains all possible forms. And in this first act of naming, a fundamental choice is made. Water is given a gender. The sweet water is male. The bitter sea is female. This is not a casual metaphor. It is a cosmological statement. The feminine principle is the salt, the chaos, the teeming, unpredictable, life-giving sea. The masculine is the sweet, the contained, the nourishing spring. Together, they mingle. From their mingling, the first generations are born, Lamu and Lahamu, the silt of the seabed. Then Anshar and Kishar, the horizons of sky and earth. And from them, the gods of the sky, the air, the land. All of them are born from the body of Tiamat. She is the mother. The salt sea is the womb of the cosmos. Every deity, every force that will shape reality, draws its first breath from her waters. She is the source. For a time, there is only this slow, cosmic gestation. The younger gods dwell within the vastness of their parents. They are energies, possibilities, but they grow, they find their voices, they move. And in the perfect, silent unity of the primordial waters, they create noise, they create disturbance, they play. To Apsu, the sweet water, this is an abomination. The silence of the deep is sacred, the unchanging order is all. He goes to Tiamat, his wife, the mother of these clamorous children. He speaks of his torment. He proposes a solution. They are powerful. They can unmake what they have made. They can return the universe to its silent, perfect, undifferentiated state. They can destroy their own offspring. This is the first crisis of creation, not a rebellion of children, but a proposed annihilation by a parent. And here, in the cracked clay of the Enuma Elish, we find a detail that centuries of retelling have often buried. Tiamat's first recorded act is not rage, it is not monstrous, it is mercy. She looks upon the gods she has borne. She hears the plan for their erasure, and she refuses. The text gives her a roar of protest. How could we destroy what we have created? Their ways are troublesome, but let us be patient. She is a mother. She will not commit infanticide. She defends the noise, the life, the messy future, against the father's desire for a return to sterile, silent perfection. In this moment, Tiamat is not the villain of the story. She is its moral center. But the threat has been uttered. The younger gods have heard. Fear now lives among them. And one of them, the clever god Ea, understands that survival requires preemption. In the dead of this timeless night, Ea acts. He weaves a powerful spell, a net of sleep and silence. He approaches Apsu as the father rests. He does not engage in a battle of elements. He murders sleep. He strips Apsu of his crown and his cloak of radiance. He kills the primordial sweet water itself, and then he does something profound. He takes the corpse of Apsu and spreads it out. He builds his own dwelling upon it. He calls this dwelling the Apsu, now meaning the subterranean freshwater ocean, but it is a conquered territory. The sweet water is no longer a living parent. It is a foundation stone, a resource, a place to live. The first patricide is also the first act of real estate. Upon this conquered foundation, Ea and his consort Damkina have a son. His name is Marduk. He is born with a destiny written in his very form. The text describes him with awe. He has 4 eyes and 4 ears. Flames dance from his lips when he speaks. He is not a force of nature like his grandparents. He is a weapon. He is designed for dominion. He is given perfect winds as his toys. He is the favorite, the champion. And in the house built on his grandfather's corpse he grows strong. Meanwhile, Tiamat grieves. She is now alone. The companion of the first mingling is gone, murdered by her own grandchildren. The noise has become lethal. And a new figure stirs the depths of her sorrow. Kingu, one of the first generation of gods, comes to her. He fans the embers of her fear and her loss. He asks a terrible question. If they could do that to Apsu, what will they do to you? The mother who refused to destroy her children is now convinced they will destroy her. The defense of life curdles into a fight for survival. Tiamat makes a fateful decision. She will raise an army. But what kind of army? She does not summon other gods. She gives birth to them. From her own essence, she brings forth a host of creatures the world has never seen. She creates the viper, the dragon, the great lion, the rabid dog, the scorpion man. She makes the Muruhudu, the serpent dragon that will become the symbol of later gods. These are not soldiers, they are monsters. They are the unleashed terrors of the primal deep, the nightmares that swim in the chaos before order. She takes Kingu, her advisor, and places him at the head of this army. She gives him the Tablet of Destinies, the object that holds the power to decree the fates of all things. Tiamat, the Salt Sea, has mobilized. She is no longer just a mother. She is a sovereign under threat, commanding the legions of the abyss. News of this army reaches the younger gods. Panic seizes them. They have no champion. Ea, who killed a sleeping Apsu, is powerless before the awakened, armored might of Tiamat. One by one, the great gods try to face her. One by one, they retreat in terror. The chaos is rising to reclaim the world. In this crisis, they turn to the last, best weapon they have created, Marduk. His father, Ea, sends word. Marduk comes, his 4 ears hearing their fear, flames licking his mouth. He agrees to confront Tiamat, but he sets a condition. It is not a request. It is an ultimatum. If he succeeds, the assembly of gods must grant him supreme and unchallenged authority. Forever. They must make him king of all the gods. His word will be law. His command will be unopposed. The gods, terrified of Tiamat, agree. They build him a throne. They invest him with the scepter and the ring of kingship. They proclaim his names. In a lavish feast, they grant him the right to decree fates. The battle has not yet been fought, but the political revolution is complete. Marduk's kingship is established by the fear of his peers. The enemy is the justification for absolute power. Now armed with the full, delegated authority of the pantheon, Marduk prepares for war. He is a spectacle of manufactured power. He creates 7 winds, including the hurricane, the cyclone, and the whirlwind. He grips a massive bow, fashions lightning as his weapon. He fills his body with flame. He sets a net, woven by the winds, to encircle Tiamat. He mounts his chariot, drawn by 4 terrifying tempest creatures. And he advances. He seeks out Tiamat in the deep. He finds her surrounded by her monstrous brood. He challenges her. He shouts accusations, framing her as the rebellious one, the destabilizer. The text is a masterpiece of propaganda, inverting the narrative. The mother defending herself from the grandchildren who murdered her husband becomes the aggressor. The one who refused infanticide is painted as the threat to all order. Tiamat, alone in her grief and rage, accepts the challenge. She roars, a sound that shakes the foundations of the deep. The battle is joined. It is not a clash of swords, it is a cosmological struggle. Marduk unleashes his weaponized winds. He drives the hurricane into Tiamat's face. As she opens her mouth to roar again, to perhaps consume him, he forces the evil wind inside her. He inflates her body with the storm. He distends her. She cannot close her mouth. The winds rage inside her, bloating her, paralyzing her. She is helpless. Then Marduk takes his spear. He aims for the heart of the swollen, wind-filled body of his grandmother. He shoots. He pierces her belly. He splits her inward parts. He cuts through her heart. He stands over her, victorious. Then, he does the unthinkable. He takes the corpse of the primordial Salt Sea, the mother of all, and he begins to dismember her. This is not mere slaughter. It is an act of world-building. With meticulous, brutal precision, Marduk takes the body of Tiamat and manufactures the universe. He splits her carcass like a giant shellfish. With one half, he roofs the sky, creating the firmament that holds back the upper waters. With the other half, he makes the foundation of the earth. From her eyes, he releases the great rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates flow from her weeping eyes. From her breasts, he forms the great mountains, anchoring the land. He pierces her skull to release the sources of the springs. He arranges her tail in the heavens to become the band of the Milky Way. Every feature of the known world is carved from her corpse. The Mesopotamian landscape is literally the butchered body of the Divine Mother. The rivers that give life to the first cities are her tears. The civilization that will write this story down is built upon her remains. Having built the world, Marduk turns to administration. He establishes the calendar, the movements of the stars. He creates humanity from the blood of Kingu, the defeated general of Tiamat's army, mixing it with clay. Humanity's purpose is to serve the gods, to free them from labor. Finally, the gods who granted him kingship build him a city. They call it Babylon, the gate of the god. They construct his temple, the Esagila, the house that raises its head, and there they celebrate. They recite his 50 names, each one a title of power. The story ends not with a moment of mourning for Tiamat, but with a hymn to the unchallengeable authority of the new king god. The epic that began with the mingling of waters concludes with the solidity of a throne. This story, the Enuma Elish, was not merely a myth to the Babylonians. It was their national epic, their creation story, and most importantly, their political constitution. It was written down in its surviving form around 1600 BCE, but its roots dig deep into older Sumerian traditions. It was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years. And once a year, during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year, this text became a living ritual. The high priest of Marduk would enter the inner sanctum of the Esagila temple. He would slap the king across the face, pull his ears, and make him kneel. The king would recite a litany of his sins, declaring he had not neglected Babylon or abused his people. Only then, humiliated and absolved, would the priest read the Enuma Elish aloud. The recitation was a reenactment of Marduk's victory. It was a renewal of the cosmic and political order. The king's reign was legitimized anew each year by this story of a god who won absolute power by killing the primordial mother. Scholars like Tikva Frye-Mackenzie and Anne Baring have traced the profound shift this story represents. It is a document of theological revolution. An older, goddess-centered cosmology, where the divine was immanent in the natural world, in the sea, the spring, the river, is violently overthrown. It is replaced by a theology of transcendent male kingship. The divine is no longer the substance of the world, it is the ruler of the world. The creator is no longer the mother who gives birth, she is the raw material to be conquered and organized by the sovereign father. Tiamat is not just defeated. She is demonized, her generative chaos redefined as monstrous threat, her self-defense recast as rebellion. This is the mythic charter for the Mesopotamian state, order imposed through violence, authority justified by the suppression of the primal feminine, the chaotic, the untamed. The consequences of this mythological murder ripple far beyond temple rituals. They seep into the very laws that govern the land and its most precious resource, water. In the earlier Sumerian city-states, water was understood as a sacred communal trust. Legal codes from places like Lagash, predating Hammurabi by centuries, contain clear provisions. Canals were to be maintained by the community. Water for irrigation was to be shared according to need. Polluting a water source was a religious offense, a crime against the divine essence of the place. The local goddess of the spring or the river was the legal guardian of that water, Her rights were the community's rights. Then comes the Code of Hammurabi, carved on a towering diorite stele around 1750 BCE, under the gaze of Shamash the sun god. Hammurabi was the king of Babylon, the city of Marduk. His law code is often hailed as a landmark of justice. But look at the laws concerning water. The focus shifts decisively. If a man is careless and allows his field to be flooded, damaging his neighbor's field, he must compensate his neighbor in grain. If a man opens his irrigation channel and lets the water run wild, he must pay for the grain he has ruined. The language is no longer about communal stewardship of a sacred resource. It is about private property, liability, and compensation. Water rights become entangled with land ownership. The management of water is no longer a sacred duty to the goddess of the spring. It is an administrative function of the state, enforced by the king's judges. The commons begin to erode. The resource begins its long journey toward becoming a commodity. This is the real, enduring legacy of the war in heaven. It is not just a story about gods and monsters. It is a story about a fundamental reorientation of human consciousness toward the natural world. When Tiamat is killed and dismembered, the salt sea is no longer a living, divine mother. It is territory. It is material. Her body parts become real estate: the sky, the earth, the rivers. The psychological shift is monumental. The world is no longer something you are born from and belong to. It is something you own, something you manage, something you conquer. The myth provides the template. The law codifies it. The king, as Marduk's representative on earth, becomes the ultimate landlord of a world built from a goddess's corpse. The rivers, born from Tiamat's eyes, continue to flow. The Tigris and Euphrates water the fields of empires that rise and fall: Babylon, Assyria, Persia. The story of their origin is told and retold, but its meaning hardens. Tiamat fades into a mere monster, a synonym for chaos. Her first act of mercy is forgotten. Her role as the mother of all is obscured. She becomes the dragon that must be slain so that order can prevail. This narrative of conquest becomes the dominant one, echoing through Western mythology for millennia. But the physical world remembers another story. The soil of Mesopotamia is famously fertile, but it is also saline. When irrigation water evaporates under the fierce sun, it leaves behind salt. Over centuries, this salt accumulation poisoned the fields, reduced crop yields, and contributed to the decline of Sumerian cities. It is as if the bitter salt of Tiamat, the essence of the slain salt sea, is seeping back up through the earth she became. A geological memory of the murder. The Enuma Elish is a foundational text of civilization, but its foundation is a grave. We live in a world shaped by its logic, the logic of separation, of dominion, of the conqueror king who brings order by dismembering the living whole. We call the rivers resources. We speak of water management. We debate ownership and rights. The language of the sacred spring, of the living goddess whose health is the community's health, has grown faint. But as we will see, this was not the only way. While Babylon recited the story of the murdered sea, other civilizations along other rivers were telling a profoundly different story. Along the Nile, a goddess wept, and her tears were not a sign of defeat, but the very source of life. Her sorrow made the desert bloom. The next chapter of our story flows there, to the river mothers of the Nile and the Indus, where water remained a living goddess, and her people remembered they were her children. The river does not ask for worship, it simply is. It rises from a distant, unseen source, carving its path through rock and sand, indifferent to the lives that cling to its banks. But to those lives, the river is everything. It is the line between hunger and harvest, between thirst and survival, between the world of the living and the silence of the desert. In the ancient world, two rivers gave birth to civilizations that would never meet, separated by mountains and millennia. The Nile, flowing through a ribbon of green in a vast red desert. The Indus, coursing from the Himalayas across a wide, fertile plain. Their waters were different, their people spoke no common tongue, and yet they arrived at the same profound understanding. The river was not a thing. It was a mother. Her annual gift was not gentle. It was a controlled catastrophe. Each summer, far to the south in the highlands of Ethiopia, the rains would come. The blue Nile would swell, carrying a torrent of eroded soil. By late July, the first tinge of brown would appear in the river at Elephantine. The water would rise, day after day, week after week, until it spilled over its banks and poured across the floodplain. It looked like destruction. It looked like the end of the world. But when it receded, it left behind a thick, wet, miraculous layer of black silt. The Egyptian word for their country was Kemet, the Black Land. This was the gift. This was the soil from which a kingdom of unparalleled endurance would grow. For 3,000 years, the rhythm held. Flood, plant, harvest. The entire Egyptian calendar, the very structure of time, was built around the inundation. But how does a culture explain such a cycle? How do you make sense of a force that gives life through what appears to be drowning? The answer was found not in hydrology, but in heartbreak. The flood was not merely water, it was tears. The tears of the goddess Isis, mourning her murdered husband Osiris. The myth is intricate, a story of betrayal, dismemberment, and resurrection. The god king Osiris is killed by his brother Set, who scatters the pieces of his body across Egypt. Isis, his sister and wife, searches the length of the land. She finds each fragment. She reassembles him. She uses her magic to conceive a son, Horus. But Osiris cannot return to the land of the living. He becomes the lord of the underworld, and Isis weeps. Her grief is eternal, and it is generative. Her tears fall into the Nile, and the river rises. Her sorrow makes the valley green. This is the central, paradoxical truth of Egyptian water theology. Fertility is born from loss. Abundance springs from divine despair. The mechanism of life is a goddess's lament. The black silt was the flesh of Osiris, renewed each year. The flood was the weeping of Isis, repeated each cycle. This was not a poetic metaphor. It was a cosmological fact written into temple rituals and state ceremonies. The pharaoh was the living Horus, the son born of this watery grief, and his duty was to ensure the tears continued to fall. The river was a divine being in its own right, a god named Hapi, depicted as a robust, androgynous figure with pendulous breasts and a belly full of offerings, representing the inundation's abundance. But the emotional engine, the human story that made the flood comprehensible, was always Isis. She was the mourner. She was the mother. She was the source. Isis would become the most documented goddess of the ancient world. Her worship would spread from Egypt to the farthest corners of the Roman Empire, but her roots are soaked in the Nile. Her earliest associations, in the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom over 4,000 years ago, are with water and the throne. Her hieroglyph is a throne. She is the seat of power, but also the vessel that contains the generative flood. For millennia, her priests performed rituals to coax the inundation, to celebrate its arrival, to give thanks for its retreat. The last act of this ancient drama took place on an island. The temple of Isis at Philae, near the first cataract, was the final bastion of Egyptian religion. Long after the Romans had converted to Christianity, The rites for Isis continued here. The faithful still came to witness the ceremony of the tears. The annual festival centered on a precise, tangible ritual. Water from the Nile, collected at the moment the flood was predicted to begin, was poured into a special basin within her temple. This water was her tears, ceremonially harvested. Then, in an act of sympathetic magic, these consecrated tears were poured back into the river from the temple steps. The gesture was a plea, a trigger, a participation in the divine cycle. The goddess weeps. We collect her tears. We return them to her so she may weep again. It was a loop of sacred reciprocity that sustained the world. This practice continued until the year 535 CE, when the Byzantine Emperor Justinian finally ordered the temple closed. The last priest of Isis performed the last rite. The tears were poured into the Nile for the final time. But the theological idea was indelible. The river was a mother who wept, and her weeping was the foundation of civilization. While Isis wept for Egypt, another river mother, in a land far to the east, was being honored in silence. The Indus River flows from the Tibetan plateau down through the mountains and across the plains of modern Pakistan and India. Between 3300 and 1300 BCE, it nurtured one of the most astonishing and enigmatic civilizations the world has ever known. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were marvels of urban planning, built with a consistency that speaks of a powerful, shared ideology. And at the heart of that ideology was water. Not as a tragic, tearful gift, but as an element of purity, order, and daily sanctity. Walk through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro today, and you walk through a city engineered for water. Almost every substantial house had its own bathing platform, a private space for ablution built with carefully fitted bricks, and a drain that connected to a city-wide sewer system. The streets were lined with covered drains. There were public wells on countless corners. This was not merely infrastructure, it was a profound cultural statement. Cleanliness was not next to godliness here, it was the very expression of the sacred. Water was the medium of ritual purity, and access to it was a fundamental right of urban life. The entire city was designed as a machine for managing water, for channeling it, for respecting it. This suggests a society where the concept of the sacred was deeply integrated with the practical, where the divine flowed through clay pipes as surely as through prayers. The most striking testament to this water-centered spirituality is not a temple or a palace, but a tank. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro is a precise rectangular pool, 12 meters long, 7 wide, and over 2 meters deep. Its bricks were laid with an eye for perfection, set in gypsum mortar, and sealed with a thick layer of bitumen to make it utterly watertight. A staircase leads down into the water at each end. It is surrounded by a cloister of rooms. This was not a public swimming pool. The scale, the construction, the location at the highest point of the city's citadel, everything marks it as a ritual space. Here, in the still, clean water, ceremonial bathing would have taken place. Initiations, purifications, rites that connected the community to the source of life. The Great Bath is a monument to the holiness of water itself. What gods were invoked here? The Indus script remains undeciphered, a tantalizing silence. We have no hymns, no prayers, no names for their deities. But the material culture speaks volumes. Across the Indus Valley sites, archaeologists have unearthed thousands of small, hand-formed clay figurines. The overwhelming majority are female. They are often stylized, with elaborate headdresses, wide hips, and prominent breasts. Some are adorned with necklaces and belts. They are found in domestic contexts, in rooms that might have been household shrines. For decades, the most famous Indus artifact was the so-called Proto-Shiva seal, a horned figure seated in a yogic posture, surrounded by animals. It has been used to argue for a male, ascetic deity at the civilization's core. But the sheer numerical weight of evidence points elsewhere. The figurines are everywhere. They suggest a religious world where the feminine principle was central, perhaps as guardians of the hearth, the family, and the water source. Scholars like Shireen Ratnagar have long argued that these figurines likely represent household deities, and that their association with water is almost certain. Their headdresses often resemble the later iconography of Hindu river goddesses. They are the mothers of the place, the keepers of the domestic well, the spiritual counterpart to the practical bathing platform. In a civilization that invested so much collective labor in water management, it is logical that the divine face of that water would be feminine. The Indus people may not have left us their scriptures, but they left us their drains and their figurines. Together, they tell a story of a society that worshipped water by building perfect channels for it, and that imagined its divine aspect as a woman. Back in Egypt, the theology of water was articulated with explicit, flamboyant mythology. Isis was the great public goddess of the Nile's grief, but she was not the only one. To understand how deeply water was woven into the Egyptian divine, we must go back to the very beginning of their cosmos. In the Heliopolitan creation myth, the sun god Ra, Atum, emerges from the primordial waters of Nun. His first act is to spit forth two children, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Water, in the form of moisture and rain, is not a secondary element. It is one of the first two beings in existence, born directly from the Creator. Tefnut is the personification of that damp, life-giving principle. She is the dew, the humidity, the rain that occasionally blessed the desert beyond the Nile's reach. One myth about Tefnut is particularly revealing. She becomes angry with her father Ra and exiles herself to the distant southern desert, taking the form of a fierce lioness. In her absence, Egypt dries up, the land withers, the people suffer. Ra sends the gods Shu and Thoth in the form of baboons to find her and coax her back. They do not command her. They entertain her with music, stories, and flattery. They remind her of her home, of her importance. Slowly, her anger cools. She allows herself to be led back to Egypt, and as she returns, the moisture returns. The land revives. This is not a story of conquest or command. It is a story of persuasion, of reconciliation with the volatile feminine force of nature. Tefnut's departure is drought. Her return is the end of drought. The myth encodes a precise environmental reality and prescribes a ritual response. You do not fight the drought, you appease the goddess who embodies moisture. So we have two river-born civilizations, two different expressions of the same profound intuition. In Egypt, water was a divine drama of death and rebirth, tears and fertility, managed by a pharaoh who was himself a god. In the Indus Valley, water was a principle of civic order and purity, managed by a society of astonishing collective discipline. But they shared a crucial, foundational approach. In both, for most of their long histories, water was treated as a sacred commons. It was not a commodity to be owned by individuals. It was a collective inheritance, a divine gift that required collective stewardship. In Egypt, the vast irrigation system that distributed the Nile's floodwaters was administered by temple scribes and officials whose authority was religious. The calendar of planting, the allocation of water to different fields, the maintenance of canals. These were acts of piety, part of the pharaoh's duty to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order. The system was hierarchical, but its legitimacy flowed from the gods. In the Indus cities, the evidence is even more striking. Archaeologists have found no grand palaces, no monumental statues of kings, no evidence of a large, centralized military. The cities are uniform. The houses are relatively equal in size and comfort. The most impressive structures are the granaries, the Great Bath, the city walls, and the water systems. Public works. This suggests a social organization that was perhaps more corporate, more focused on communal welfare than on glorifying a single ruler. The sophisticated drainage system required constant, coordinated maintenance from the entire community. It would not have functioned if one neighborhood decided to dump refuse into the street drain. The system only works if everyone agrees to the rules, if everyone sees the value in keeping the water clean. The theology, implied by the female figurines and the ritual bath, provided the sacred rationale for that social contract. Water was holy, therefore keeping it pure was a holy duty for all. This is the critical contrast. For millennia, this was the dominant model for human interaction with life-giving water. The river was a mother, a goddess, a living being with rights and a personality. You negotiated with her, you appeased her, you wept with her, you kept her channels clean. You did not simply extract from her. The relationship was reciprocal, and it was encoded in myth, ritual, and law. This theological framework created a powerful ecological constraint. You cannot easily pollute a goddess. You cannot casually divert the tears of Isis for a private vineyard. You cannot let the Great Bath become fetid without offending the divine principle it represents. The sacred status of the water source acted as a form of ancient environmental protection. The longevity of these civilizations is a testament to the sustainability of this model. Egyptian civilization maintained its core relationship with the Nile for over 3,000 years. The Indus Valley cities flourished for nearly 2 millennia. Their declines were complex, involving climate shifts, river course changes, and possibly external pressures. But for the bulk of their existence, their water theology provided a stable, resilient foundation. It rooted their societies in a story that made the vital resource sacred and inviolable. The Mother River demanded respect, and in return, she provided. This was the deep, ancient equilibrium. But the world was changing. New stories were being told, stories where water was not always a mother. Stories where it was a prize to be won, a boundary to be crossed, a force to be dominated by male heroes and sky gods. The age of the river mothers, of Isis and Tefnut, and the unnamed goddesses of the Indus, would face a slow, relentless challenge. A different kind of water deity was emerging in the rocky landscapes of the Mediterranean. Here, the water sources were smaller, more scattered springs, streams, and mountain pools. And here, the feminine divine of the water would take a new form, one that was intimately local, fiercely protected, and perpetually under threat. The nymphs of Greece were not grand, river-spanning goddesses. They were the spirit of the particular spring, the soul of the single, vulnerable pool. And their stories would be tales not just of nurturing, but of pursuit, of flight, of theft. The sacred commons was about to be enclosed. The transition is almost audible in the shift of mythology. From the deep, rhythmic sorrow of Isis feeding a nation, to the desperate flight of a single naiad from a pursuing river god. The scale changes from the cosmic to the personal, from the assured cycle of the flood to the precarious survival of the spring. The theology of water as a mother, a generous, if grieving, source of life for all, begins to fracture. In its place arises a theology of water as a possession, an object of desire, a resource to be captured and controlled. The nymphs would become the symbols of this vulnerability. Their wells and springs would become sites of contention, their bodies metaphors for the water itself. The great, nurturing river mothers of Egypt and the Indus belonged to a world of abundance and collective faith. The world that followed would be one of scarcity and competition. The tears of Isis would give way to the theft of the springs. This is not to say the mother goddesses disappeared. Isis would be worshipped for centuries more, her cult spreading across the seas. The idea of the sacred river would persist in lands far to the east. But a new tension was introduced into the human relationship with water. The concept of the commons, protected by the sacred feminine, would now have to contend with the concept of private appropriation, often sanctioned by male-dominated pantheons and heroic myths. The story of water was becoming a story of conflict. And it would be in the sun-drenched hills of Greece, among the olive groves and city-states, that this new chapter would be written with particular clarity. The nymphs were about to be chased, and their fate would mirror the fate of the springs they personified. The age of taking was beginning. The light in Greece is a different kind of light. It is not soft, it is not gentle. It is a sharp, white clarity that carves every stone, that turns the sea into hammered bronze, that makes the air itself seem to vibrate with a dry, musical hum. In this landscape, water is not a given, it is a miracle. It is a sudden coolness in a dry riverbed, a dark stain of moss on a sun-bleached cliff, a sound of trickling where there should only be the rasp of cicadas. To stand on a Greek hillside in high summer is to understand thirst as a geographical fact. And in that understanding, you begin to see the nymphs. They are everywhere in the stories. They flicker at the edges of the heroic tales. They whisper in the rustling of reeds. They are the daughters. The 50 Nereids, born to the old man of the sea, their laughter the sound of foam on a sheltered shore. The 3,000 Oceanids, daughters of the world encircling river Oceanus, as countless as the waves. And then, most intimately, the Naiads, the nymphs of the springs, the nymphs of the streams, the lakes, the marshes. For every source of fresh water in the Greek world, there was a name, there was a face, there was a life. This is not poetic decoration, it is a map of consciousness. It is a way of seeing the world where every drop that sustains you has a spirit, a will, a story. The water is alive. And it is almost always female. The theology is precise, and it is local. The naiad of the spring on the slope of Mount Penteli is not the same being as the naiad of the spring at the base of the Acropolis. She has her own history, her own preferences, her own name known to the villagers who depend on her. She is not a symbol of the water. She is the water. Her physical body and the liquid essence of the source are one and the same. If you honor her, keep her grove clean, offer simple gifts of flowers or honey, the water flows clear and cold. If you harm her, if you foul her pool, if you draw too greedily, if you spill blood on her sacred ground, she suffers. She grows sick, she withdraws, and the water vanishes. The connection is absolute. The well-being of the spirit and the health of the resource are inseparable. This is an ancient environmental principle, written not in law books, but in the bedrock of belief. This belief had teeth. It had legal consequences. Across the Greek world, from the rocky fields of Attica to the sacred precinct of Delphi, inscriptions carved into stone laid down the law of the nymphs. At Corinth, a decree forbade the washing of clothes in a certain spring. At Athens, regulations protected the sacred water of the Enia Krounos fountain. The language is not bureaucratic, it is personal. The crime is not pollution. The crime is harming the naiad. The fine is not a municipal fee. It is a compensation owed to the divine person you have injured. A 4th century BCE inscription from the island of Mykonos is starkly clear. It is not permitted to throw anything impure into the spring, for the naiad is pure. The spring has rights because the nymph has rights. Her sacred status functions, with remarkable efficiency, as an environmental protection statute. To violate the spring is to commit sacrilege, a crime against a goddess, punishable by the state and, more terrifyingly, by divine wrath. The most eloquent expression of this theology is a story of flight. It begins in the Peloponnese, in the lush valley of the river Alpheus. Arethusa was a naiad, a devotee of the goddess Artemis, who loved to hunt in the forests and bathe in the cool streams. One day, the river god Alpheus saw her. He desired her. He pursued her. Arethusa, terrified, fled. She ran until her strength gave out, until the sound of his rushing waters grew deafening behind her. She called to her patron goddess, Artemis, and Artemis acted. She wrapped Arethusa in a thick mist, and then she transformed her. The nymph's body dissolved into water, seeping down into the earth, becoming a spring. But Alpheus was relentless. A river god, he followed her. He changed his own course, plunging into a chasm, becoming an underground river that flowed silently through the darkness of the earth, chasing her. The myth says Arethusa traveled beneath the sea. She journeyed under the Ionian Sea, her fresh water flowing in a secret tunnel through the salt, until she burst forth again into the light on the island of Ortygia, in the harbour of Syracuse, Sicily. There she became a great, beautiful spring, a fountain of fresh water surrounded by a grove of papyrus, a stone's throw from the salt sea. And Alpheus, they say, followed her there too. His waters mingled with hers in the Sicilian spring. The story is haunting. It is a story about a female water being with no recourse but to flee a male pursuer, to escape into the very earth, to be utterly transformed to preserve her autonomy. Her only victory is disappearance and rebirth elsewhere. But the Greeks were also hydrologists. They knew of mysterious underground connections between distant springs. They observed that the water of certain Sicilian sources tasted of the herbs that grew in Peloponnesian valleys. The myth of Arethusa encodes a real, observable phenomenon: subterranean aquifers, karstic channels, within a powerful narrative of pursuit and metamorphosis. The science is true. The tragedy is also true. This world of intimate, local female spirits existed long before the grand pantheon of Olympus was assembled. The sea itself had an older ruler. Before Poseidon with his trident and his tempestuous rage, there was Nereus, the old man of the sea. He was a primordial deity, a shapeshifter known for his truthfulness and his gentle prophetic knowledge. He was married to Doris, an Oceanid, and together they had the 50 Nereids, who personified every aspect of the sea's character, from the calm wave to the crashing surf. This was a maritime theology of wisdom and familial abundance. Poseidon was a different kind of god entirely. His origins seem to lie not with the sea but with the horse and the earthquake, perhaps brought by Greek-speaking peoples from the northern steppes. When these newcomers arrived in the Aegean, they encountered the existing sea cults. They did not erase them. They grafted their powerful martial horse god onto the older, deeper figure of the Sea Lord. The takeover is memorialized in myth. The contest for Athens is the clearest fossil record. Both Poseidon and Athena desired to be the patron of the great city. Poseidon struck the Acropolis rock with his trident, and a saltwater spring burst forth. Athena offered the olive tree. The city chose the gift of peace and sustenance over the gift of the sea and war. Athena won. But the story is not just about a choice. It is about the displacement of an older water deity by a newer Olympian order. Poseidon's salty, useless spring on the Acropolis symbolizes his foreign, somewhat clumsy in position onto a landscape already full of sacred, life-giving freshwater springs tended by nymphs. The Olympians brought a new hierarchy, a new model of divine power that was centralized, patriarchal, and often violent. The gentle Nereus and his countless daughters were not destroyed, but they were demoted. They became subjects in a new divine kingdom. Yet, in certain places, the ancient reverence for the living spring held its ground with immense power. Nowhere more so than at Delphi, the navel of the world. Before anyone could approach the temple of Apollo, before the Pythia could descend into the Adyton to breathe the vapors and speak the gods' riddles, they had to be purified. And this purification came from a single sacred source, the spring of Castalia. It gushed from a deep fissure in the sheer cliff of the Phaedriades, the shining rocks. Its naiad was not a minor spirit. She was the gateway to prophecy. The rituals were strict, immutable. Pilgrims had to wash their hair in her cold, clear waters. No one could approach her unwashed. No blood, from sacrifice or battle, could ever be shed near her precinct. To violate Castalia was to corrupt the very channel of divine communication. The spring was the domain of women in a very practical sense. The hydrophoroi, the water carriers, were a designated group of young women from Delphi who fetched the sacred water for rituals. Their role was essential, formal, and respected. They were the keepers of the threshold. The physical space of the spring, carved into the living rock, reflects this intimate, necessary care. A large, rectangular basin was cut into the mountainside where the crowds could wash. Higher up, a more secluded, older basin was reserved for the priests and the Pythia herself. The water's role was active. It didn't just clean the body, it prepared the soul to receive the god. The naiad of Castalia was the first and most critical interlocutor in the prophetic process. Her consent, manifested in the uninterrupted flow of her pure water, was the first requirement for any oracle to be spoken. You can stand there today. You can touch the same stone. The water still flows, ice cold and shockingly clear, from that same dark crack in the Phaedriades. The grooves worn by countless pilgrims washing their hair are still visible in the marble lining of the basin. It is a direct, physical connection to a 2,000-year-old habit of thought. Here, the belief in the living spring was not a rustic superstition. It was the foundational civic and religious doctrine of the most influential sanctuary in the ancient world. The spring was a person, and the person was a spring, and the fate of nations could hinge on her well-being. But systems change. Theologies evolve. As the Greek world expanded from independent city-states into the Hellenistic kingdoms, and then the Roman Empire, the status of the nymphs underwent a subtle, profound shift. The legal personhood of the naiad, her capacity to be injured and to demand legal redress, began to fade. In poetry and art, nymphs became decorative. They were the beautiful, semi-clad figures frolicking in idyllic landscapes in pastoral verses. They were motifs in mosaic floors in wealthy villas. The hard, legalistic edge of the old inscriptions gave way to a softer, aesthetic appreciation. The nymph was becoming a symbol again, rather than a sovereign. Concurrently, the administration of sacred springs was bureaucratized. The role of the female hydrophoroi, the direct caretakers, was often absorbed or overseen by male priesthoods attached to the major temples of Olympian gods. At Delphi, the spring of Castalia was, of course, under the ultimate authority of the temple of Apollo, whose priests were male. The protection of the water source remained, but the rationale shifted slightly. It was less about the inherent rights of the naiad, and more about maintaining ritual purity for the Olympian god's cult. The source of authority was moving upstream, from the spring itself to the temple that managed it. The intimate, direct relationship between a community and its local water goddess was being mediated by a larger, more impersonal religious institution. This reclassification had a quiet consequence. As the nymphs became figures of literature rather than jurisprudence, the legal protections that had sprung from their sacred personhood inevitably weakened. The fines for polluting a spring were still on the books, but their enforcement relied on the vigilance of civic authorities whose priorities were increasingly complex. The idea that harming a water source was a crime against a conscious, feeling being, a being who could sicken, flee, or die, retreated from the legal sphere and retreated into the realm of folklore. It remained a powerful story, a cultural memory, but it no longer carried the same binding civic weight. The environmental principle embedded in the theology became unmoored from its divine anchor. We can trace this drift in the very language. The word nymph gradually accreted connotations of the charming, the ephemeral, the slightly trivial. By the time of the Roman Empire, a nymphaeum was often a magnificent public fountain, an architectural showcase for water brought by aqueduct from miles away. It was a celebration of human engineering, of imperial bounty. The spirit of the place, the original naiad whose home had been capped and channeled into this marble monument, was now an ornamental statue spouting water from a carved mouth. The living being had become a decoration. The theft was not of the water which still flowed. It was of the spring's soul, its agency, its legal and spiritual standing. The water was now a resource to be managed, not a relative to be respected. This story of Greece is a story of a slow, profound transition. It begins with a world animated by countless female spirits of place, where every gully and hillside had a consciousness, and where the law recognized that consciousness. It ends with a world where those spirits are remembered as beautiful myths, while the real power over water, the engineering, the administration, the legal framework resides in human, and overwhelmingly male, hands. The nymphs did not die. They were pensioned off. They were moved from the courthouse and the sacred grove into the pages of poetry and the niches of public gardens. The protection they offered the land became metaphorical, then nostalgic, then largely forgotten. The clear, cold logic that said, if you harm the water you harm a goddess, was replaced by a more complicated, and ultimately more fragile, calculus of utility and control. The legacy of the nymphs, however, is written in the very stones of Greece. It is in the worn steps leading down to a hidden spring. It is in the ancient inscriptions warning of divine wrath for polluters. It is in the story of Arethusa, a tale of hydrological truth wrapped in a desperate flight for freedom. This was a system that worked. For centuries it protected the sources of life by granting them life itself. It made the sacred practical, and the practical sacred. As the Greek model of the world spread and evolved, it carried this paradox with it, a deep cultural memory of water as a feminine divine force, increasingly overshadowed by structures of power that sought to command it. This tension between the living river goddess and the king who would rule her would not remain in the Mediterranean. It would travel. It would find its most stark and bureaucratic expression far to the east, in a civilization that would turn water management into an imperial science, and the dragon into an administrator. The journey from the personal naiad to the imperial dragon king is a journey across continents and across the human imagination. A journey that begins with a whisper in a Greek spring and ends with an edict from a celestial throne. In the beginning, before emperors and before dynasties, the waters of China were a story of chaos and creation. The land was unformed, the sky was broken, and the first act of order was not conquest, but repair. This is a mythology that opens with a flood, a catastrophe of water unleashed from a shattered heaven. And standing against that deluge is not a warrior king, but a goddess with the body of a serpent and the hands of a mason. Her name is Nua, and she is the mother of all. She is the first engineer, the first architect of the cosmos. While other creation myths speak of God speaking worlds into being, the Chinese tradition tells of a goddess who worked with her hands, who gathered and melted, who propped and patched. The flood was the problem. She was the solution. Her domain, from the very start, was the management of water in its most violent and world-altering form. The catastrophe began with a battle among the gods. The water deity Gong, in a rage of defeat, smashed his head against Mount Buzhou, one of the pillars holding up the sky. The pillar shattered, the sky tilted towards the northwest, and the earth sank in the southeast. The stars began to drift from their courses, and through the rupture poured the waters of the heavenly river, a deluge that threatened to drown all of creation. This was not a gentle inundation bringing fertile silt. This was cosmic collapse, a structural failure at the heart of the universe. The response required not prayer but profound physical ingenuity. Nua traveled to the riverbeds of the world and collected stones of 5 colors: black, white, red, yellow, and blue. She built a furnace and melted them down, forging a celestial patch of incredible strength. Then she lifted this patch to the broken sky and sealed the breach, but the sky still sagged. So she sought out the giant sea turtle, the owl, a creature whose legs were like mountain ranges. She cut off its 4 legs and journeyed to the 4 corners of the world, using them to replace the broken pillar and steady the heavens once more. The flood receded. Order was restored. But the cost was written into the world's very geography. The tilted sky, the sunken earth, the rivers of China that forever flow southeast, following the slope she could not fully correct. Nua's form is the key to everything that follows. She is half human, half serpent. This is not a monstrous shape, but a divine one, connecting her to the primal forces of the earth and water. The serpent is a creature of the deep, of hidden springs and underground currents. In her, the feminine creative power and the aquatic, earthbound dragon are one and the same. She is the original dragon, the original water deity. Yet, in the mythology that crystallizes over the following millennia, the dragon becomes a male symbol of imperial power, and the sovereign of the waters becomes a king. Nua recedes into the distant, foundational past, a mother who fixed the world so that fathers could rule it. Her story establishes a pattern we will see again and again. An ancient, powerful female water divinity is superseded by a male, bureaucratic one. The engineering compassion of the goddess gives way to the administrative control of the dragon king. But her shape never truly disappears, it simply changes costume. From cosmic floods, we descend to a single earthly river. It is the color of the soil it carries, a thick, swirling ochre that paints the land. This is the Huanghe, the Yellow River, the cradle of Chinese civilization. It was not merely a geographic feature. It was a living, divine being with a temperament as volatile as its currents. In the classical texts of the Zhou and early Han dynasties, the river has a master, He Bo, the river earl. He is a male deity, often depicted as a nobleman riding a water dragon or a giant fish. He demands respect and sacrifice. The legendary poem, The 9 Songs, from the Chu Chi, describes a shaman's journey to win his favor, a dangerous courtship of a powerful, capricious spirit. This is the official face of the Yellow River in the Age of Empires, a male aristocrat who must be negotiated with, a personification of state power. But beneath this official theology lies a deeper, older layer. Long before He Bo received his title, the communities along the river's banks understood its power in a different way. At a place called Jiahu, in what is now Hainan province, a Neolithic village thrived nearly 9,000 years ago. The archaeology here is not about kings or gods, but about community and ritual. The people of Jiahu built their homes around a water source. They buried their dead with care, and in some graves they placed sets of bone flutes, the oldest playable musical instruments ever discovered. They also created pottery, and on some jars they painted designs, patterns that may represent water birds or ripples, or the very movement of the river itself. These are not the trappings of a bureaucratic water god. They are the artifacts of a lived relationship with water as a source of life, music, and possibly feminine spiritual power. The graves of certain women at Jiahu are particularly elaborate, containing ritual objects that suggest they held special status, perhaps as shamans or keepers of the water cult. The association of women with water gathering and water ritual is a global Neolithic pattern, and Jiahu hints that China was no exception. The water was not yet an earl to be petitioned. It was a presence to be lived beside, a force that sustained the village, a spirit that might be thanked with music and honored with ceremony led by women. This subtle archaeological evidence suggests a female-centered water veneration that predates the masculine river earl by thousands of years. The Yellow River's first daughters were not mythological figures, but real women who drew its water, sang its songs, and were buried with its symbols. Then came the dragons, not the primal serpentine form of Nuwa, but a new kind of creature, imperial, male, and organized. The Dragon Kings, the Longwang, emerge as the dominant water deities of imperial China. They do not dwell in the formless chaos of Nuwa's time, nor in the simple village springs of Jiahu. They reside in elaborate crystal palaces at the bottom of rivers, lakes, and seas. These are not wild nature spirits. They are celestial bureaucrats. Each Dragon King has a specific jurisdiction: the Dragon King of the East Sea, the Dragon King of the Yellow River, the Dragon King of a particular lake. They have ranks, subordinates, and a strict chain of command that leads up to the Jade Emperor in his heavenly court. This is water theology completely reimagined as imperial administration. The Dragon Kings control rain, rivers, and storms not through emotional caprice, but through official decree and paperwork. Temples to the Dragon Kings were often built and maintained by the state. During droughts, magistrates would lead processions to these temples, presenting formal, written petitions for rain, as if submitting a report to a superior ministry. The unpredictable, life-giving force of water had been placed within a hierarchical, masculine framework of control. The Dragon King does not love the river he governs. He manages it. He allocates its resources. He punishes insolence with flood or drought. This theological shift mirrors perfectly the political centralization of the Chinese state. Just as the emperor claimed the mandate of heaven to rule all under heaven, the Dragon Kings claimed divine authority over every drop of water in the realm. The compassionate, engineering goddess was forgotten, replaced by a department head. Yet, the old ways did not die. They flowed underground like a hidden spring and emerged in the vibrant world of folk religion. While the imperial court promoted the cult of the bureaucratic Dragon Kings, the people, especially those whose lives depended directly on the water's mercy, clung to a different kind of protector. Along the stormy coast of Fujian province, a different story was being written. It began not with a god, but with a girl. Her name was Lin Mo, born in 960 CE. She was not a goddess, but a human being renowned for her kindness and her uncanny ability to predict storms. Legends say she would enter trances, her spirit traveling across the waves to guide foundering ships to safety while her body remained at home, seemingly asleep. When she died young, the fishing communities refused to let her go. They began to worship her as a protector of sailors. She became Mazu, the mother ancestor. Her cult spread like wildfire along the Chinese coastline. By the Song dynasty, there were over 1,500 temples dedicated to her. Her image was not that of a distant bureaucrat, but of a benevolent young woman, often seated and calm. She was a goddess who acted out of compassion, not duty. The imperial court, recognizing her immense popularity, repeatedly tried to co-opt her. They granted her official titles, from Princess of Supernatural Favor to Heavenly Empress. But this bureaucratic absorption never fully succeeded. The heart of Mazu worship remained local, female, and personal. Her annual festival processions, where her statue was carried through the streets to bless the community, were expressions of grassroots devotion, not state ritual. She was the people's goddess, a daughter of the water who understood their fears because she had once been one of them. In Mazu, the feminine, protective, personal aspect of water divinity survived the imperial masculization, thriving outside the official channels of power. This tension between an older female water power and a newer male administrative order is etched into the very stars. One of China's most beloved myths is the story of the weaving girl and the cowherd. Zhinu, the weaving girl, was a granddaughter of the Queen Mother of the West, Shiwangmu. She fell in love with a mortal cowherd, Niu Lang. They married and were blissfully happy, but their neglect of their duties, weaving the clouds and tending the heavenly oxen, angered the Queen Mother. As punishment, she took a hairpin from her hair and slashed it across the sky, creating a wide silver river to separate the lovers forever. That river is the Milky Way. This is not just a romantic tragedy. It is a story about water, power, and gender. The Queen Mother of the West is one of the most ancient and potent deities in the Chinese pantheon, far older than the Jade Emperor. Her realm is the mythical Mount Kunlun, and at its heart lies the Jade Pool, the source of immortality. She controls the waters of life itself. She is a sovereign female power whose authority is intrinsically linked to water. In the myth, she uses water, the celestial river, as a tool of discipline, but also as a permanent tragic barrier. The Jade Emperor, the male head of the later bureaucratic pantheon, is often inserted into the story as the one who permits the lovers, one annual meeting across a bridge of magpies. But the original agent, the one who wielded the transformative, separating power of the water, was the Queen Mother. She is another reminder, before the Dragon Kings administered the waters, older, formidable goddesses controlled them. The theological story of China's water deities finds its brutal, physical counterpart in the environmental history of the Yellow River itself. The river's nickname is China's Sorrow, and for good reason. In recorded history, it has flooded over 1,500 times. It has changed its major course 26 times, each shift causing unimaginable destruction and displacing millions. This volatility is partly natural, due to the immense silt load it carries from the lowest plateau. But human action dramatically amplified the disaster. As the Chinese state grew more centralized and powerful under dynasties like the Han, Tang, and Song, its agricultural ambitions soared. To feed enormous populations, the upland forests along the river's upper reaches were cleared for farmland. Without tree roots to hold the soil, erosion skyrocketed. The river's silt content increased, its bed rose, and it burst its man-made levees with ever greater frequency. The imperial response was not to reconsider the ecological model, but to double down on control. The water management bureaucracy became the largest and most complex administrative body in the world. Engineers devised elaborate systems of dikes, canals, and spillways. The Dragon Kings were invoked with increasing desperation and grandeur. The emperor himself would perform rituals, pleading for their intervention. But the floods kept coming, each one potentially threatening the mandate of heaven itself. The theology of control had met a force it could not ultimately govern. The Dragon Kings, for all their bureaucratic might, could not hold back the consequences of empire-scale environmental change. By the late Qing dynasty, the river was a monster of the state's own creation, a muddy testament to the failure of a system that sought to administer nature as it administered people. The story of China's water gods is a story of a profound transformation. It begins with a goddess who repairs a flooded world with her own hands and her own compassion. It flows through the quiet, communal rituals of Neolithic women at a village spring. Then, it is channeled into the official cults of male river earls and, finally, the vast, impersonal bureaucracy of the Dragon Kings. Yet, the feminine never disappears. It survives in the grassroots devotion to Mazu, the sailor's daughter. It echoes in the starry authority of the Queen Mother of the West. It is a duality etched deep into the culture: water as a wild, life-giving feminine force to be revered, and water as a resource to be managed, controlled, and administered by a masculine imperial order. The Yellow River, with its devastating floods, became the ultimate test of that control. And in its relentless yellow silt, this journey from the primal, feminine waters of creation to the managed, masculine waters of empire is not unique to China. It is a pattern we have seen unfold across continents and millennia. But as the theological framework shifted, so did the relationship between people and the life-giving source. The goddess who was the spring demanded protection. The Dragon King who governed the river demanded petition. One model fostered reverence, the other, negotiation. And as we turn from the imperial waterways of Asia to the vast, terrifying expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, we will witness a different kind of water journey, one where a goddess was not replaced, but carried. Carried in the hearts and memories of people torn from their homes across a middle passage of unspeakable horror. On that brutal voyage, the ocean was not a bureaucratic domain. It was the body of a mother, and her name was Yemanjá. The ocean is not empty. It is a body. It has a memory. It holds within its salt the stories of continents torn apart, of families separated by unimaginable distance, of a journey that was not a journey but a theft. And in the deep, indigo heart of that water, a presence waited. She was not born of this ocean, not at first. She was carried here, in the minds and the whispered prayers of people who crossed her new domain in chains. Her name is Yemanjá. And her story is the story of a goddess who survived the Middle Passage. To understand her, we must begin where she began, far from the Atlantic's roar. In the lush, river-cut lands of what is now southwestern Nigeria and Benin, the Yoruba people developed one of the most complex and enduring theological systems in human history. At its heart are the Orishas, divine forces that govern every aspect of the natural and human world. And among them, one holds dominion over water. Her full name is a sentence, Yeye Omo Eja, Mother, whose children are like fish. This is not a metaphor of mere plenty. It is a theology of radical, generative maternity. The ocean's boundless life, its schools of silver fish, its ceaseless movement, are all expressions of a mother's nature. Yemanjá is the womb of the world. She is fertility, nurture, the source of life itself. Her earliest domain was not the sea, but the Ogun River, a vital artery of the Yoruba homeland. She was the spirit of that flowing fresh water, the guardian of its banks, the answer to prayers for children and for peace. Her symbols are the elements of a woman's world: the comb that parts hair, the mirror that reflects the self, the fan that brings coolness, the peacock feathers that speak of beauty and display. She is associated with the moon, which pulls the tides, linking her cycles to the cycles of women's bodies. She is order, calm, and the deep, often stern, love of a matriarch. Before the catastrophe, she was a river goddess. But history was about to force a terrible, vast migration upon her people. And her domain would expand, horrifically, to encompass the entire Atlantic Ocean. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, a machine of unprecedented scale and cruelty was built across the Atlantic. The transatlantic slave trade. Historians estimate that approximately 5 million Africans were captured, sold, and forcibly transported to the Americas. Of that unimaginable number, a very significant portion came from the region where Yemanjá was worshipped. From the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra, slave ships carried away thousands of Yoruba-speaking people, along with their neighbours, the Fon, the E, the Igbo. They called this place the Slave Coast for a reason. The journey was called the Middle Passage. It was the central, hellish leg of the triangular trade. For weeks or months, human beings were packed into the holds of ships with a precision born of profit. The infamous diagram of the British slave ship Brooks, used by abolitionists, showed 454 people arranged like cargo. The space between decks was often less than 5 feet. People were shackled together, lying in their own waste, with minimal food and water. Disease was rampant. Mortality rates could reach 20% on a single voyage. The ocean crossing was a protracted, rolling tomb. And all the while, the ship moved across the water. For the Yoruba people below decks, this was a theological catastrophe of shattering dimensions. They were being carried across the body of their goddess. The very element that was their prison was, in their spiritual understanding, a divine being. The salt spray that stung their faces, the terrifying waves that rocked their floating coffin, the endless, indifferent horizon. This was Yemanjá. What prayer could be made in such a place? Was she witnessing their suffering? Was this her will? Or was she too a captive of this new, monstrous world? The survival of faith under such conditions is not a passive act. It is an act of fierce, defiant memory. With no physical possessions, with their families shattered, with their very names often taken from them, the enslaved carried what they could not be stripped of, their cosmology. The names of the Orishas, the rhythms of the drums, the stories of creation and morality were held in minds and hearts. They were whispered in the hold. They were hummed in the fields. They were the invisible cargo that the slave ships could not log in their manifests. Yemanjá crossed the Atlantic not as a conquering deity, but as a refugee in the souls of her children. The place where this memory took deepest root, where it flowered with astonishing vitality, was Brazil. More enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil than to any other country in the Americas, nearly 5 million people. Here, the Yoruba tradition did not just survive, it transformed and became known as candomblé. And in this new world, Yemanjá found a new throne. The river goddess of West Africa became the queen of the sea, the sovereign of the vast Brazilian coastline. Her domain was no longer a single river, it was the entire Atlantic that had brought her people to this shore. Every year, on the 2nd of February, this survival becomes a spectacle of devotion. In Rio de Janeiro and Salvador da Bahia, millions of devotees, followers of candomblé, umbanda, and countless others drawn to her power, gather at the water's edge. They come dressed in white and blue, Yemanjá's colors. They bring offerings carefully chosen for their goddess, white roses, mirrors, combs, bottles of perfume, ribbons, and tiny boats made of wood or styrofoam. The ritual is precise, beautiful, and direct. The offerings are placed on small boats or wrapped in cloth. Devotees wade into the surf, often led by the Mães de Santo, the mothers of the saint, the priestesses who are the spiritual leaders of the community. They push the gifts out beyond the breakers, into the embrace of the ocean. If the offering is accepted, it sinks or floats away. If it washes back to shore, it is a sign that Yemanjá is displeased, that the devotee must reflect and try again. It is a conversation, a transaction of love and respect with a divine person. This festival, one of the largest religious gatherings in the Western Hemisphere, is not an invention. It is a direct, unbroken lineage. Every flower cast into the water, every prayer whispered on the wind, is a thread connecting the beaches of Brazil to the riverbanks of Nigeria. It is West African water theology, performed on American sands. The goddess survived the Middle Passage, and this is her annual celebration of that impossible journey. But survival required a strategy. It required a brilliant, painful act of theological camouflage. Enslaved Africans in Brazil and throughout the Catholic colonies were forced to convert to Christianity. Their own rituals were banned, often under penalty of severe violence. The response was not abandonment, but syncretism, a profound and creative fusion. The Orishas were paired with Catholic saints who shared similar attributes or symbols. Yemanjá, the maternal queen of the sea, was identified with Our Lady of the Navigators or with Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception. Both are virgin figures associated with water, purity, and protection. This was far more than a deceptive facade. It was a deep theological negotiation. The enslaved and their descendants did not simply hide their goddess behind a saint, they found their goddess within the saint. They recognized the sacred feminine in a new form. Yemanjá, the mother of fish, flowed into the figure of Mary, the mother of God. The water goddess survived inside the body of a Christian virgin. The Catholic Church provided the icon. The African spirit provided the living, breathing divinity behind it. This syncretism created something entirely new, a Brazilian spirituality with Yoruba bones. The Candomblé tradition that preserved Yemanjá is not a vague set of beliefs. It is a precise science of the sacred, encoding specific ecological knowledge within its rituals. Yemanjá's colors are blue and white, the colors of the ocean and its foam. Her offerings are strictly regulated. They must be things that float, or that dissolve cleanly in salt water. You do not offer the goddess plastic. You do not offer her anything that would poison her body, because her body is the water. The sacred spaces of Candomblé, called Ile or Terreiros, are traditionally built near natural water sources, springs, rivers, or the seashore. The relationship is geographical and non-negotiable. The theology carries within it an inherent environmental ethic. You do not pollute what belongs to the goddess. You do not abuse a source that is literally divine. This is not abstract philosophy. It is a set of instructions for living with water, embedded in dance, song, and offering. It is a survival manual for the human relationship with the natural world, forged in the crucible of displacement. This knowledge was protected at immense personal cost. The survival of Yemanjá worship is also a stark history of political resistance. In Brazil, laws against witchcraft and African sorcery persisted for centuries. Candomblé was illegal, its practices criminalized. Well into the 20th century, police raids on terreiros were common. Priestesses and priests were arrested, sacred objects were destroyed, drums were confiscated. The very act of pouring water for Yemanjá was an act of defiance. The guardians of this tradition, most often, were women, the Mães de Santo. They were the community leaders, the healers, the keepers of memory. They maintained the water theology against relentless state and religious persecution for generations. They hid the sacred stones in their kitchens. They recited the prayers in coded language. They passed the stories to their daughters and spiritual daughters. Their resistance was not with weapons, but with ritual. They insisted that the ocean was a mother, not a resource, and in doing so, they preserved a way of seeing the world that the dominant culture sought to erase. The story of Yemanjá, then, is multiple stories layered like the ocean's depths. It is the story of a West African river goddess who became an Atlantic queen. It is the story of a theology that crossed an ocean in chains and not only survived but thrived. It is the story of syncretism as a brilliant strategy of cultural preservation. And ultimately, it is a story about what human beings choose to carry when everything else is taken from them. They carried their understanding of the divine. They carried the name of the Mother of Waters. And in giving that name to the new, terrifying sea that had swallowed their old lives, they performed a profound act of re-enchantment. They made the agent of their suffering into a source of solace and strength. The legacy is alive on every Brazilian beach, every February. It lives in the communities of the African diaspora in Cuba, Uruguay, and the United States, where Yemanjá is also worshipped. It lives in the environmental consciousness embedded in the ritual, the knowledge that you do not give the goddess trash. The Middle Passage sought to reduce people to property. The response was to insist that even the ocean was a person, a mother, with a name, with preferences, with a right to respect. This is perhaps the ultimate resistance, to look at the vast, impersonal force that was used as a tool of your subjugation, and to say, "You are my family. You are sacred." From the tears of Isis that flooded the Nile, to the protective flood of Chalchiotlicu, we have seen water deities whose sorrow is generative. Yemanjá's story adds another, more modern dimension, the goddess whose survival is tied to the survival of a people. Her waters are the waters of memory, of trauma, and of incredible resilience. She reminds us that the sacred is not static, it migrates, adapts, and endures. As we turn our gaze from the Atlantic to another continent, we find a river where the goddess never left, where she is worshipped by hundreds of millions, not as a memory, but as a living, flowing presence. From the salt womb of Yemanjá, we journey to the freshwater descent of Ganga Mata, Mother Ganges, where the concept of a river as a goddess is the foundation of a civilization, and where that very belief now faces its most profound test. The air is thick with incense and the low murmur of 1,000 prayers. The water she pours is not just water, it is Gangajal. It is the liquid body of a goddess, carried hundreds of miles from a specific riverbank to this quiet room. It is the last taste on a dying man's tongue, the final sensory bridge between this world and the next. For millions, this is not symbolism, it is the most concrete reality of their faith. The river is alive, the river is a mother. The river is Ganga Mata, and she has descended from heaven to walk among us. Her story begins not with geography, but with a desperate negotiation between the divine and the mortal realms. The myth is precise in its hydraulic engineering. The goddess Ganga existed first in the realm of the gods, a torrent of pure consciousness and purifying power. A king named Bhagiratha prayed for millennia to bring her down to earth, to cleanse the ashes of his ancestors. But her descent was a cataclysm waiting to happen. The force of a goddess in her full celestial form would shatter the continents. So Shiva, the great ascetic, offered his head as a buffer. He caught the crashing divine river in the tangled forest of his hair, slowing her rage, breaking her fall into a manageable flow. She emerged from his locks not as a destructive flood, but as a life-giving, seven-streamed river. This is the foundational theology. The Ganges is a deliberate gift, a controlled release of divine grace into the material world. Her water, Ganga, is therefore a theological substance. A drop does not represent purification, it performs it. It cleanses a lifetime of sin not through metaphor, but through the physics of her divine nature. To carry that water to a deathbed, to sell it in sealed bottles in markets 1,000 miles from her banks, is to traffic in the literal essence of a goddess. The river is not like a mother, she is mother. Her banks are her lap, her currents are her embrace. This personhood is ancient, and it is explicitly feminine. The voice that first sang this truth into the historical record is found in the Rig Veda, composed over 3,000 years ago. Within its hymns lies the Nadi Stuti, the hymn to the rivers. It is a roll call of divinity. The poet names and praises 10 great rivers of the Indian subcontinent, and every single one is a goddess. They are not merely associated with feminine deities, they are addressed as the deities themselves. The Sindhu, the mighty Indus. The Shatadru, the Sutlej, the Vitasta, the Jhelum. Their names are her names, their flow is her will. But one name in that hymn holds a particular, haunting power, the Saraswati. She is praised as a goddess of wisdom, of eloquence, of creative power. She is called the best of mothers, the best of rivers. In the Vedas, she is a mighty, life-giving stream, the greatest of them all. Yet in later Vedic texts, the tone changes. The hymns become laments. She went to the ocean, the mother of waters, one verse mourns. She has become invisible. The goddess Saraswati did not fade from memory. She vanished from the landscape. Modern geology and satellite imagery have confirmed the corpse of this myth. A major river system, once rivaling the Indus, did indeed dry up around 1900 BCE due to tectonic shifts and climatic change. The death of the Saraswati was a real, catastrophic hydrological event. But in the human experience, it was the death of a goddess. The cosmic loss echoed in the texts triggered one of the largest migrations in South Asian prehistory, reshaping the subcontinent. A civilization built around a living goddess of water had to flee when she died. The theology was so literal that the river's disappearance was an existential theological crisis. This deep history establishes a pattern. The river's health and the goddess's life are one and the same. That pattern does not lie dormant in ancient texts. It erupts into the modern world in a spectacle of faith that defies scale. The tradition is not merely ancient, it is continuous, visceral, and overwhelming. The Kumbh Mela, the festival of the pot, rotates between 4 sacred river sites. But its most profound manifestation is at Prayagraj, at the Sangam, the confluence of the Ganges, the Yamuna, and the invisible, subterranean Saraswati. Here, the mythology becomes a city. An entire pop-up metropolis is built for one purpose: to bathe. On the most auspicious day, Morni Amavasya, the silent new moon, an estimated 50 million human beings entered the water in 2019. 50 million. It is the largest peaceful gathering on Earth. Think of that number not as a statistic, but as a collective action. 50 million individuals, each with private sorrows, hopes and sins, walking into the cold current seeking direct physical communion. They are not bathing in a symbol, they are immersing themselves in the living body of Ganga Mata. For them, the theological reality is as tangible as the water soaking their clothes, as the chill on their skin. The river as deity is the premise of the ritual, not its poetic interpretation. This faith is not a relic. It is a roaring, living engine of culture, identity, and meaning for nearly 1 billion people. It is a worldview where nature is not an it, but a she. And it is this worldview that now faces its most severe contradiction. The Yamuna River, the Ganges' great sister, flows through the capital, Delhi. For 22 kilometers through the city, the river is clinically dead. No dissolved oxygen, no fish, no aquatic life of any kind. It is a sluggish black artery of industrial effluent, untreated sewage, and chemical waste. The foam that gathers on its surface is not natural. It is a poisonous byproduct of detergent and industrial discharge. This is not just a polluted waterway. This is the goddess Yami. In Hindu theology, she is the sister of Yama, the god of death. She is also the beloved of Krishna. The sacred texts and songs describe the divine play of Krishna dancing with the goddess Yamuna on her moonlit banks at Vrindavan. The river where a god danced is now a drain. The goddess who was a dance partner is now suffocating under a blanket of human waste. The contradiction is staggering. Millions offer prayers to Yamuna Ji, celebrating her divine love stories. Meanwhile, the city they built dumps over half of its untreated sewage directly into her body every day. The goddess is being killed by the very civilization that composes hymns in her name. This is the central, painful paradox of modern India. A culture that perceives its rivers as living goddesses is systematically poisoning them. The faith remains vibrant, but the physical entity that faith is directed toward is dying. This contradiction is not lost on those who worship, study, and fight for these rivers. For decades, the Indian government has launched ambitious cleanup plans. The Ganga Action Plan began in 1986, reborn later as the Namami Gange program, with billions of rupees allocated for sewage treatment plants and riverfront development. The results, according to independent scientific audits, have been woefully inadequate. The pollution levels remain dangerously high. The goddess, in her physical form, continues to sicken. This gap between theological reverence and ecological abuse has forced a profound legal and philosophical question. If the river is a person, shouldn't she have rights? In a landmark 2007 ruling, the Uttarakhand High Court attempted a radical synthesis. It declared the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, along with the Gangotri and Yamunotri glaciers that feed them, to be legal persons. They were granted the rights of a living human entity. The ruling was poetic in its logic. Since the rivers are worshipped as goddesses, they should be recognized as juridical persons. The state was appointed their legal guardian. For a brief moment, the ancient theology was translated into modern jurisprudence. The goddess almost became a legal person. Then, she didn't. The Supreme Court of India swiftly stayed the order, citing practical and jurisdictional complexities. Who, exactly, could sue on behalf of the river? Could the river itself be held liable for flooding? The legal experiment was suspended. The attempt, however, reveals a desperate search for a framework that matches the depth of the cultural belief. If our laws treat the river as mere property, a resource to be owned and exploited, How can they protect something that millions experience as a conscious, sacred being? The court's struggle mirrors the larger societal struggle. This struggle is not just about pollution, it is about flow. Embedded within the ancient theology is a sophisticated ecological principle, a viral dhara. It means the uninterrupted, continuous flow of the river. A river that does not flow cannot breathe. It cannot dilute pollutants, support ecosystems, or recharge groundwater. In the theological framework, a viral dhara is essential to Ganga's purifying power. A stagnant Ganga is a contradiction in terms. A blocked goddess is a harmed goddess. Modern water management, driven by demands for irrigation and hydropower, has systematically violated this principle. Dams and barrages have turned the Ganges into a series of managed pools. The Tehri Dam, one of the tallest in Asia, completed in 2006, is the most dramatic symbol. It submerged the ancient town of Tehri, a pilgrimage site for millennia, along with the sacred confluence of the Bhagirathi and Bilangana rivers, the very headwaters considered especially potent. The goddess was damned. The pilgrimage site is now underwater, accessible only in the dry season when the reservoir level drops, revealing the ghostly outlines of drowned temples and streets. This is not just an engineering project, it is a theological dislocation. The faithful are left to worship a reservoir, a placid lake where a raging, living river once descended. The knowledge contained within the concept of a viral dhara, that a river's health is its movement, was encoded in myth and ritual long before modern ecology coined the term environmentally flow. That ancient knowledge was ignored. The result is a river strangled at its source, its divine continuity broken by concrete. The tension is palpable at every ghat, every riverbank temple. You see it in the face of a priest performing the ancient Ganga Aarti at Varanasi at dusk. His movements are precise, choreographed over centuries, an offering of fire to the water goddess. The ceremony is breathtaking, a symphony of light and sound affirming the river's divinity. And yet, the flames illuminate water that, just upstream, may carry the waste of a city, the runoff from a tannery. The same hands that lift the lamp in reverence may later wash in water that carries disease. This is the daily lived reality for millions, a profound, unwavering belief in the goddess, and a pragmatic, often painful coexistence with her polluted physical form. The faith itself is a form of resilience, but it is also a mirror held up to a profound societal failure. The ecological crisis of India's rivers is, therefore, a uniquely spiritual crisis. It is not merely about cleaning a waterway, it is about healing a wounded goddess, reconciling a deep cultural identity with the brutal demands of modern development. The solutions, if they are to be found, must speak both to the scientist's data and to the pilgrim's heart. They must address sewage treatment plants and the theological necessity of a viral dhara. They must consider legal personhood, not as a bureaucratic novelty, but as a sincere attempt to codify a truth that has existed for 3,000 years. The river is alive. She has a name. She has a story. And she is dying in the arms of her children. This story of sacred rivers, of goddesses reduced to drains, is not unique to India. It is a pattern repeating wherever ancient water theologies have collided with the modern industrial world. As we leave the ghats of Varanasi, our journey turns westward, across the oceans to another continent where water deities faced a different kind of cataclysm. In the highlands of Mesoamerica, rain was not a gentle blessing but a fearsome negotiation with male storm gods, while in the deep forests of ancient Europe, the guardians of the springs were not grand river goddesses, but local well women, their power rooted in the specific, quiet magic of a single source. The next chapter asks, what happens when the water gods are not mothers, but lords? And what wisdom was held in the custody of the Celtic well women, before their sacred sources were capped and forgotten? The air in the Valley of Mexico is thin and dry, a high-altitude desert where the sun bleaches the sky to a pale, unforgiving blue. Here, water is not a given. It is a desperate, urgent negotiation between earth and sky. The rain does not fall. It must be summoned, pleaded for, bought with a terrible price. This is the domain of the storm, ruled by a god of thunder and terror. But beneath his tempest, another power flows. She is the river in the ravine, the lake at the city's edge, the quiet, persistent seep of a spring from volcanic rock. She wears the water as a garment. She is the jade skirt that moves with a liquid grace, older than the thunder, deeper than the drought. To understand the rain, one must first meet the Lord who commands it. Tlaloc. His name echoes with the sound of wet earth. He is one of the oldest deities in all the Americas, his visage carved into the temple of the feathered serpent at Teotihuacan centuries before the Aztec Empire rose. He is not a gentle bringer of showers. He is the master of the violent, life-giving tempest, the hail that shreds crops, the lightning that splits the sky. His dwelling, Tlalocan, is a paradise of eternal summer and abundance, but the path to his favor is paved with the most harrowing of currencies, the tears of children. The logic was as brutal as the climate. To summon the rain, one must first present its symbolic essence. The weeping of the innocent was the most potent offering, a sympathetic magic to coax the clouds to weep in turn. His worship was statecraft, a terrifying contract between a fragile empire and an unstable sky. Yet beside this fearsome male storm stands a figure of profound, flowing permanence, Chalchiuhtlicue, she of the jade skirt. While Tlaloc rules the water that falls, she is the water that flows. She is the lakes that cradled the Aztec capital, the rivers that cut through the highlands, the springs that nourished the first villages. Her iconography is one of serene, liquid beauty. Her skirt is not merely decorated with jade, it is composed of it, each carved plaque a symbol of precious, life-sustaining fluid. She wears the river as her identity. In the oldest fragments of Mesoamerican thought, scholars trace her lineage back further than the storm gods. She represents the primordial feminine source, the water that is simply inherently there, before any god deigns to dispense it. This duality finds its most profound expression in the story of the worlds that came before. Aztec cosmology tells of 5 successive suns, each an era of humanity destroyed by a different catastrophe. The 4th sun, the sun of water, was ruled by Chalchiuhtlicue. For 52 years, a complete cycle in the Mesoamerican calendar, she wept. Her tears were not of anger, but of an overwhelming, protective grief. She wept until the heavens themselves could no longer hold the weight of her sorrow. The sky collapsed, and the waters rose in a cataclysm that drowned the world. But this was not an act of annihilation. As the floodwaters surged, Chalchiuhtlicue transformed the people of that era, the beings she loved, into fish. She changed their very nature so they might survive within her own liquid body. Here, in a mythology an ocean away from the Nile, we find the same astonishing theological structure. The flood is not a punishment. It is an act of salvation wrought through divine grief. The feminine water deity weeps, and her tears become the medium of both destruction and preservation. Chalchiuhtlicue, like Isis, embodies the paradox that sorrow can be generative, that a goddess's love can take the form of a deluge. She does not send the water, she becomes it, swallowing her children to save them. The storm god brings the rain through transaction and threat. The river goddess enacts the flood through an emotion so vast it reshapes the cosmos. Far to the east, in the limestone flatlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, water reveals itself not from the sky, but from the underworld. Here, there are no rivers on the surface. The rain, when it comes, vanishes instantly into a porous, thirsty stone. The lifeblood of Maya civilization emerged from below in the form of cenotes, natural sinkholes where the limestone ceiling has collapsed, revealing secret pools of groundwater. These are not mere reservoirs, they are portals. The Maya knew them as seds or not, mouths leading directly into Xibalba, the place of fright, the watery underworld of gods and ancestors. The rain deity here was male, Shak, with his curling serpentine nose and axe of lightning. But the cenotes themselves, these thresholds to the deep, were inherently female sacred spaces. They were the mouths of the earth, waiting to speak or to swallow. The most famous of these is the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza. It is a perfect, near-circular well of green water, 60 feet from its rim to the surface, and another 60 feet down into darkness. For centuries, it was the most revered ritual site in the northern Yucatan. Beginning in 1904, an American diplomat and amateur archaeologist named Edward Thompson bought the hacienda that included the cenote and began a decades-long dredging operation. Using a wooden dredge, and later, divers in heavy suits, he recovered a treasure not of gold alone, but of intent. The offerings were cast into the green depths to placate and petition the lords of Xibalba. Thompson found exquisite works of jade from the Guatemalan highlands, gold discs hammered with intricate scenes, bells, beads, and pottery from across the Maya world. He also found human remains, mostly of young men and children. These were not necessarily victims of sacrifice in the Aztec sense, but perhaps chulel, sacred messengers, entering the mouth of the underworld to carry the community's pleas directly to the source of all water. The cenote was a conduit. Every object that sank into its depths was a word in a sustained, centuries-long conversation with the divine. Across the Atlantic, in the damp green hills of Celtic Europe, water spoke a different, quieter language, but the listener was the same. Here, the theology of sacred water was not just female, it was stubbornly, resiliently so. When the Roman legions pushed into the misty island of Britannia, they encountered a people devoted to a goddess named Sulis. She presided over a miraculous place where hot, mineral-rich water boiled up from the earth at Bath. The Romans, masters of hydraulic engineering and religious syncretism, did not demolish this faith. They recognized power when they felt it. They built a magnificent temple complex over the springs, dedicating it to Sulis Minerva, a fusion of the local goddess of the waters and their own goddess of wisdom and craft. The Romans, in essence, joined the queue. They added their own curses, inscribed on lead sheets and tossed into the sacred spring, asking Sulis Minerva to punish thieves of their bathing towels. The goddess accepted all petitions. Her water flowed, unchanged, beneath the marble floors. This pattern of continuity becomes a torrent in the Celtic Christian world. The old gods were baptized, not buried. Ireland alone is dotted with over 3,000 holy wells, each a tiny nexus of the sacred. The vast majority are dedicated to female saints: Brigid, the foster mother of Christ; Gobnite, the beekeeper; Attractor, the healer. Scholars see in these saints the clear Christianized forms of pre-Christian goddesses, often associated with the same springs. Brigid, whose feast day marks the beginning of spring, almost certainly inherits the mantle of a powerful Celtic goddess of healing, poetry, and sacred fire that was also connected to water sources. The rituals performed at these wells are threads leading back into deep time. The practice of tying a clutes, or rag, to a nearby tree, a piece of cloth that carries an illness or a prayer, is not a Christian invention. It is a direct survival of Iron Age votive offerings, where strips of cloth or metal were left to petition the local genius of the spring. The well was not a convenience. It was a neighbor, a guardian, a living entity with a personality and a memory. To foul it was to invite supernatural retribution, sickness, misfortune, the curse of the community. The protective taboo was woven into the fabric of social and spiritual life. This is the common thread that binds the cenote of Chichen Itza and the holy well of County Clare. The sacred status of the water source generated a powerful, self-enforcing conservation ethic. The water was not a resource to be managed, it was a person to be respected. The penalty for violation was not a fine, but a fracture in one's relationship with the divine and the community. In Mesoamerica, this protective theology was shattered by the Spanish conquest. The gods were declared demons, the rituals forbidden. The cenotes lost their sacred identity and became, simply, holes in the ground containing water. The consequences were slow, but inevitable. Without the goddess who wore the jade skirt, without the understanding of the cenote as a sacred mouth, there was no cultural barrier to pollution. The sacred cenote itself was not spared. In the 1960s, in a final, starkly symbolic act of disenchantment, Mexican archaeologists used an industrial dredge pump to suck silt from its bottom, searching for more artifacts. The mouth of the underworld was vacuumed clean. Today, agricultural runoff seeps into many cenotes, clouding the pristine waters with nitrates. The protective theology that preserved them for a millennium is gone, replaced by a framework that sees only utility and profit. The water remains, but its meaning has evaporated. This is the quiet catastrophe that follows the death of a god. It is not merely a change in story, it is a change in behavior. When Chalchiutliku's jade skirt is seen as mere metaphor, and not as the living skin of a river, the river becomes a sewer. When the holy well is seen as a quaint superstition, and not as the dwelling of a saint who is herself a memory of a goddess, the well is capped, built over, forgotten. The Aztec and the Celt, separated by an ocean and millennia of independent thought, arrived at the same profound practical truth: to protect the water, you must first perceive it as sacred. You must give it a name, a gender, a story, and a right to exist for its own sake. The rain lords demanded tribute. The well women demanded reverence. And in that reverence lay a simple, ancient law: do not harm the one who gives you life. As the modern world faces a crisis of thirst, as rivers are drained and aquifers pumped to dust, we are left to reckon with what was lost when these conversations with the water ceased. We mastered the hydrology, but we severed the covenant. The pipelines and pumping stations are our new temples, but they contain no goddess, no saint, no protective story beyond the brittle logic of economics. The rain lords have been replaced by weather models. The well women have been silenced by utility bills. And the water, no longer spoken to, is beginning to disappear. We stand now at the edge of a different kind of cenote, looking into a deepening dryness, and we must ask the final, terrible question: what is the price of forgetting the water was ever alive? The answer lies not in the past, but in the parched future we are creating, a world where the only thing left to weep may be ourselves. The water has always been sacred. For 10,000 years, we have told stories of its divinity. We have carved its likeness in stone, sung its praises in hymns, built civilizations upon its banks. We have understood it as a mother, a goddess, a living being with a will and a voice. We have knelt at its source in reverence, knowing our lives depended on its grace. That knowledge was not just spiritual. It was practical. It was survival. To see the water as sacred was to see it as inviolable. It was to build a covenant with the source of life itself. That covenant shaped laws, dictated rituals, forged communities. It was a theology of protection. But what happens when that theology fades? What happens when the sacred becomes merely a resource? When the goddess is forgotten, and all that remains is a commodity? The story of water in the modern world is the story of that forgetting. It is a story of pipes and profits, of thirst and protest, of a fundamental bond severed. We have built a world of astonishing technological prowess, yet we have failed at the most basic human task, to share the gift of life equally. The sacred burden now is not one of worship, but of justice. It is the burden of 2 billion people waiting for a drink of clean water. The scale of the crisis is not an abstraction. It is a number with a human face, 2.2 billion. That is the current count, according to the United Nations, of people who lack access to safely managed drinking water. It is a population larger than any continent except Asia. They are not gathered in one place, but scattered across a concrete geography of need. In sub-Saharan Africa, the daily chore of water collection falls disproportionately on women and girls. They walk an average of 6 kilometers, often before sunrise, to reach a source that may be a muddy pond, an unprotected well, or a distant borehole. The weight of a full 20-liter jerrycan is 20 kilograms. This is not merely an inconvenience, it is a theft of time, of education, of safety. The hours spent hauling water are hours not spent in school, not spent generating income, not spent resting. The journey itself can be perilous, exposing women to the risk of assault. The water they finally bring home, at such great cost, may still carry the seeds of disease, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, turning the source of life into a vehicle of death. In South Asia, the challenge is often one of contamination rather than absolute scarcity. Vast river systems like the Ganges and the Indus are choked with industrial effluent, agricultural runoff, and untreated sewage. For the millions who live along their banks, the goddess is now a drain. The theological reality of Ganga Mata as a purifying being crashes against the biological reality of fecal coliform counts 1,000 times above safe limits. In the sprawling megacities of India and Bangladesh, the urban poor often rely on erratic municipal tanker trucks or expensive private vendors. The water ration is a moment of tense negotiation, a daily reminder of precarious citizenship. Meanwhile, in the agricultural heartlands, the relentless pumping of groundwater for irrigation has caused water tables to plummet, leaving hand pumps and shallow wells dry. The ancient Saraswati disappeared over millennia. Modern aquifers are being emptied in decades. This geography of thirst extends into the wealthiest nations on earth. It exists in the shadows of prosperity, in the forgotten corners of the so-called developed world. In the First Nations communities of Canada, dozens have lived under long-term boil water advisories for years, some for decades. The water that flows from their taps is not safe to drink, cook with, or sometimes even bathe in. In the United States, communities of color, from the majority, black city of Flint, Michigan, to the rural Latino communities of California's Central Valley, face systemic failures of water infrastructure and quality. In Flint, a decision to switch the city's water source to the corrosive Flint River in 2014, without proper treatment, led to lead poisoning, an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, and a public health catastrophe that exposed deep fractures of race and class. The crisis was not a natural disaster, it was a policy choice. It revealed that even where water flows through pipes into every home, the covenant of care has been broken. The sacred burden of water is not borne equally. For millennia, human ingenuity has been directed at the problem of water delivery. The great civilizations were, in essence, water management systems. The Romans built aqueducts that were marvels of gravitational engineering, bringing fresh mountain water hundreds of kilometers to their cities. The public fountains, the baths, the sewers, they were expressions of a civic ideal, a belief that clean water was a public good, a cornerstone of civilized life. In the arid landscapes of Persia and the Arabian Peninsula, the Qanat system was developed over 3,000 years ago. These were gently sloping underground tunnels that tapped into mountain aquifers and transported water by gravity to the surface, dozens of kilometers away, minimizing evaporation. They were feats of communal labor and precise surveying, maintained by generations of a single family or a village cooperative. The water was shared according to strict time allotment rules. The system was sustainable, tapping only the renewable portion of the aquifer. It was technology in service of an equitable, enduring relationship with a scarce resource. The modern world has inherited this legacy, but often failed its promise. Today's water delivery gap is a chasm between ancient infrastructure and contemporary need, between engineering potential and political failure. In countless cities across the global south, the official piped network reaches only a fraction of the population, often the wealthiest neighborhoods. The rest rely on a patchwork of informal solutions: private tanker trucks that charge exorbitant rates, illegal connections to mains that weaken the whole system, or a return to the ancient practice of carrying water from distant standpipes. Even where pipes exist, they are often century-old systems, leaking up to 40 or 50% of their water before it reaches a tap. The problem is not a lack of technology. We have the materials, the engineering knowledge, the hydrological data. The problem is a lack of investment, of maintenance, of governance. Municipal water departments are often underfunded, politicized, and riddled with corruption. The NGO response, while vital, is piecemeal. A new borehole here, a filtration system there, struggling to keep pace with urban explosion and climate change. The grand Roman vision of water as a public service has shrunk to a reality of intermittent supply, dubious quality, and daily uncertainty for billions. When the public system fails, a seductive solution is often presented: privatization. The argument is one of efficiency. A private corporation, driven by profit, will have the capital and the expertise to fix leaky pipes, expand networks, and deliver clean, reliable water. Water becomes a commodity, like electricity or telecommunications. But what happens when the life-giving essence becomes a product to be sold? The answer was written in the streets of Cochabamba, Bolivia, in the year 2000. The Bolivian government, under pressure from the World Bank, granted a 40-year concession to a multinational consortium to manage the city's water. Almost immediately, rates skyrocketed, in some cases by 200%. For the city's poor, this meant choosing between water and food. The contract was so sweeping it even claimed rights to regulate community-owned wells and rainwater collection barrels. In response, a broad coalition of factory workers, farmers, students and housewives formed La Coordinadora, a grassroots movement that shut down the city for weeks. The protest, known as the Cochabamba Water War, was met with violent repression, but the people prevailed. The contract was cancelled. The message was clear: water is not a commodity, it is a common good. Cochabamba became a global symbol of resistance to the idea that life itself could be subject to a profit margin. The logic of commodification, however, is pervasive. In 2014, the city of Detroit, Michigan, embarked on a massive program of water shutoffs. Facing bankruptcy and a crumbling water infrastructure, the city's emergency manager decided to aggressively collect unpaid bills. Over the next few years, tens of thousands of households, overwhelmingly poor and black, had their water service terminated. The consequences were dire. Families were forced to collect water from neighbors or public buildings, to use bottled water for cooking and flushing toilets, to live in conditions that health officials warned could lead to disease outbreaks. Children's welfare agencies threatened to remove kids from homes without running water. The United Nations condemned the shutoffs as a violation of the human right to water. Detroit exposed a brutal truth: in a system where water is a billed utility, the inability to pay becomes a sentence to thirst. It is the criminalization of poverty, using the most basic human need as the weapon. The experiment in Manila, Philippines, tells a story of a different failure. In 1997, in one of the world's largest water privatization deals, the city's water system was divided into two concessions, east and west, awarded to 2 consortia with major international players. The initial results were promising: billions of dollars in investment, network expansion, and improved service for many. But the model began to fray. One concessionaire, Maynilad, faced financial collapse by 2003, unable to recoup its massive investments from the tariffs it was allowed to charge. It demanded huge rate increases, which were denied by regulators, leading to a protracted legal battle and an eventual government takeover of its operations. The other concession, Manila Water, was successful for a time but became embroiled in its own crisis in 2019 when a severe water shortage hit the East Zone, leaving millions of taps dry for weeks. The crisis revealed over-reliance on a single aging reservoir and failures in long-term planning. The Manila story is not a simple tale of good versus evil, but a complex lesson. Even with private capital and expertise, water management requires transparent regulation, realistic pricing, and, above all, accountability to the public. When the primary motive is shareholder return, the long-term resilience of the system and the needs of the poorest can be the first casualties. In the face of these systemic failures, innovation is flowering at the margins. It is not always high-tech. Often, it is a revival of ancient wisdom with a modern twist. In the arid mountains of Chile and Peru, communities are reinstalling and improving ancient fog-catching nets. These large polypropylene mesh panels capture microscopic water droplets from the coastal fog, which then drip down into collection channels, providing a precious, clean supply for drinking and irrigation. In Iran and Oman, there is a renewed interest in restoring the ancient Qanat systems, recognizing their sustainable genius in an era of groundwater depletion. Meanwhile, cutting-edge technology offers other paths. Atmospheric water generators, which use condensation or advanced desiccants to pull drinking water directly from the air, are becoming more efficient and affordable. Solar-powered versions can operate off-grid, offering a potential solution for remote communities. Low-cost filtration technologies, like life straw-type devices and ceramic filters impregnated with silver nanoparticles, can make contaminated water safe at the household level. The knowledge exists. The blueprints are drawn. The prototypes work. The barrier is rarely the technology itself. It is scale, distribution, and, most persistently, political will. A fog catcher can serve a village, but what about a city of 10 million? A household filter protects one family, but does nothing to clean the poisoned river upstream. These innovations are vital, life-saving stopgaps, but they are not substitutes for the political and financial commitment to rebuild public water as a universal human right. The story of water justice is not a story waiting for a technological silver bullet. It is a story about power, priority, and the values that shape a society's budget. We choose what to fund, we choose what to fix. The fact that simple, effective solutions exist for so many water problems, yet remain unimplemented for billions, is the starkest indictment of our global priorities. It reveals a world that can marshal trillions for financial markets or military hardware, but cannot summon the collective will to guarantee a glass of clean water for every child. On July 28, 2010, the United Nations General Assembly took a historic step. By an overwhelming majority, it passed a resolution explicitly recognizing the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as a human right that is essential for the full enjoyment of life and all human rights. It was a moment of profound moral clarity, championed by countries like Bolivia that had felt the sting of water injustice directly. The resolution was non-binding, but it established a powerful normative framework. It stated that water is not a charity to be bestowed, nor a commodity to be purchased only by those who can afford it. It is a right inherent to human dignity. This was the modern world attempting to codify, in legal language, the ancient understanding of water as a sacred trust. It was an attempt to rebuild the covenant on a foundation of human rights law. Yet, a decade later, The gap between this legal recognition and the lived reality for 2.2 billion people is a chasm of implementation. Why has this right not been enforced? The reasons are a tapestry of political and economic resistance. Enshrining a right means imposing obligations, primarily on states. It means governments must prioritize water infrastructure in their budgets, regulate polluters aggressively, and ensure equitable access for all, including the most marginalized. This requires taxing, spending, and challenging powerful interests. It conflicts with austerity policies that slash public investment. It clashes with the business models of bottled water corporations and large-scale agribusiness that view water as an input to be extracted cheaply. It challenges the sovereignty of nations that control upstream river sources. The human right to water also implies a limitation on the right of corporations to profit from its control. This creates a fundamental tension in a global economic system built on commodification. Furthermore, the right is difficult to adjudicate in court. Who is liable when a child dies from waterborne disease? The municipal government? The national ministry? The international financial institution that recommended privatization? The legal pathways are murky, and the political costs of enforcement are high. So the right remains, for many, a right on paper, a promise whispered in the halls of Geneva and New York, but unheard at the dry well in a rural village. As fresh water becomes increasingly scarce, this unresolved tension is fueling the defining geopolitical conflicts of the 21st century. Water is no longer just a local issue or a humanitarian concern. It is a strategic resource over which nations are preparing to fight. The world's great river basins have become chessboards of hydraulic power. On the Nile, a millennia-old lifeline, a new chapter is being written. Ethiopia is constructing the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a massive hydroelectric project on the Blue Nile. For Ethiopia, it is a project of national pride and development, a source of electricity for millions. For downstream Egypt, which depends on the Nile for over 90% of its water, the dam represents an existential threat. Decades of tense negotiations have failed to produce a binding agreement on how to fill the dam's reservoir and operate it during droughts. The rhetoric has hardened, with Egyptian leaders historically stating that water is a matter of life and death, and hinting at military options. The Nile dispute is a classic case of upstream development clashing with downstream dependency, a conflict where ancient rights meet modern needs, and where diplomacy is racing against the clock of a changing climate. In Southeast Asia, the Mekong River is suffering a similar fate. A cascade of large dams built by China in its upper reaches, and by Laos and Cambodia downstream, has disrupted the river's natural flood pulse. This pulse was the engine of the world's most productive inland fishery, and the natural irrigation system for the rice paddies of Vietnam's Mekong Delta. Now, with water held back in reservoirs and sediment blocked, the delta is sinking and salinating. Farmers watch as salt water intrudes further inland each year, poisoning their fields. The fish catches decline. The conflicts here are less overtly militarized, but no less devastating, playing out in lost livelihoods, forced migration, and the slow death of a way of life. Meanwhile, in the arid Middle East, transboundary aquifers, underground water reserves, are being mined unsustainably. In the American West, the Colorado River Compact, a century-old agreement dividing the river's water among 7 states and Mexico, is buckling under the strain of over-allocation and a megadrought. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the river's giant reservoirs, have dropped to historic lows, threatening water supplies for tens of millions and hydroelectric power for the grid. These are not future scenarios. They are present-day crises. The weaponization of water can take many forms. It can be the construction of a dam, the poisoning of a source, or simply the overpumping of a shared aquifer. As groundwater levels drop in regions like the Punjab in India and Pakistan, or the Ogallala Aquifer in the United States, The potential for conflict between farmers, between states, and between nations intensifies. Water scarcity acts as a threat multiplier, exacerbating existing social fractures, fueling migration, and undermining state stability. The wars of the future may not be declared over water, but water stress will be a primary driver of their instability. This is the ultimate consequence of forgetting the sacred. When water is merely a resource to be captured, a commodity to be traded, or a weapon to be wielded, we enter a zero-sum game with life itself. The ancient theologies understood water as a relationship. The modern geopolitical paradigm sees it as an asset. The difference between those two views is the difference between cooperation and conflict, between sustainability and collapse. Yet, even within this landscape of crisis, new old ideas are emerging, attempting to bridge the ancient covenant and the modern legal system. In 2017, New Zealand passed groundbreaking legislation granting the Wanganui River legal personhood. The law, Te Awa Tapua, states that the river is an indivisible and living whole, and recognizes it as a legal entity with its own rights and interests. This was not a poetic gesture. It was the culmination of over a century of advocacy by the Maori iwi, or tribe, who view the river as an ancestor. The law appoints two guardians, one from the Maori community, one from the Crown, to represent the river's interests in all decisions affecting it. This means that if a company wants to dump effluent or divert water, it must consider the river's own right to health and well-being. It is a radical attempt to translate a sacred, relational worldview into the language of Western law. Similar rights of nature laws have been passed in Ecuador, Bolivia, and, in limited forms, in parts of India and the United States. They represent a profound philosophical shift, away from seeing nature as property, and towards seeing it as a rights-bearing entity. It is the legal system straining to recreate the protections that theology once provided automatically. This movement finds its most powerful expression not in courtrooms, but in communities. Around the world, from the water committees of Cochabamba to the village councils of Rajasthan reviving ancient rainwater harvesting structures, people are taking water back into their own hands. They are practicing a form of water democracy, participatory, transparent, and rooted in local ecology. These are modern expressions of the ancient communal systems that maintained the qanats and protected the sacred springs. They recognize that technology and infrastructure are empty without governance, and that governance fails without the active, informed participation of the people who depend on the water every day. These local systems are not a rejection of the state's role, but a demand for a different kind of partnership, one based on subsidiarity, where decisions are made at the lowest effective level, and where the state's role is to support, regulate, and ensure equity, rather than to control or commodify. The sacred burden of water justice, therefore, falls on multiple shoulders. It falls on engineers to design resilient, appropriate systems. It falls on lawyers to defend the human right and the rights of nature. It falls on politicians to make courageous budgetary choices. It falls on each of us as consumers to understand the true cost of the water embedded in our food, our clothing, our energy. But perhaps most importantly, it falls on storytellers and teachers. We must recover the stories that connect us to water, not as users, but as kin. We must teach the next generation the hydrology of their place, where their water comes from, where it goes, who shares it. We must resurrect, in secular or spiritual terms, a sense of wonder and responsibility for the water cycle that sustains all life. The ancient goddesses, Ganga, Chalchiotliku, Yemanjá, were personifications of this responsibility. They made the abstract cycle personal, the ecological imperative a moral one. In a disenchanted world, we must find new narratives that are equally powerful. The challenge is monumental, but the path is illuminated by countless points of light. It is the Brazilian favela that built its own rainwater catchment system. It is the Indian village that ended waterborne disease by mapping and protecting its springs. It is the American city that replaced lead pipes. It is the international treaty that successfully manages the Rhine River. These successes prove that change is possible. They prove that when communities are empowered, when rights are recognized, when innovation is directed by equity, water can become, once again, a source of life and dignity for all. The alternative is a world of deepening inequality, of fortified water privileges for the wealthy, and of perpetual conflict over a dwindling resource. It is a world where the sacred has been not just forgotten, but actively betrayed. We stand at a pivot point in the long human story of water. For millennia, our relationship was defined by reverence and a fragile local balance. For the past century, it has been defined by extraction and engineering hubris. The next chapter must be defined by restitution and justice. It must be about repairing the pipes and repairing the covenant. It requires us to see the water crisis not as a technical problem to be solved, but as a moral failure to be addressed. The 2.2 billion who wait are not a statistic, they are a verdict on our global community. Their thirst is the measure of our humanity. As we look ahead to the final reckoning, to the price of forgetting all that came before, we must ask what we are willing to remember, and what we are willing to fight for. The water remembers its own sacred history. The question is, do we? The river remembers what we have forgotten. It remembers the weight of the current, the taste of the sea. It remembers the ceremonies. For 10,000 years, human beings looked into moving water and saw a face. They saw intention, personality, a living will. That perception was not a primitive mistake. It was a covenant. A covenant written not on parchment, but in the structure of society itself. The pattern is now visible across 10,000 years and every inhabited continent. Wherever water was understood as a living divine being, specific protective institutions grew up around it. The being was almost always female, personal, possessing agency and rights. This was not decorative mythology. It was functional ecology. Legal prohibitions against fouling sacred springs are found from ancient Greece to pre-colonial India. The inscription at the spring of Kalirohor in Athens imposed a fine for washing clothes or dumping waste. The harm was not to the city's sanitation system, but to the nymph. To injure her was a religious crime. Ritual requirements maintained minimum flows. In the Andean world, offerings to Pachamama and the mountain springs, the Apu, were made not just for abundance, but to ensure the water's continued journey. You thanked the water for coming. You acknowledged its journey. Communal governance structures prevented private monopolization. The meter system of the Andes, the Subak of Bali, the water courts of Valencia, these were not economic agreements alone. They were the social expression of a theological principle. The water belongs to itself and to the community it sustains. No one could own the Naiad. You could only be her steward. The theology was an ecology. The goddess was a law. And then we repealed the law. We demoted the goddess. We declared the water a resource, a commodity, a slave. The 21st century now faces the consequence. A water crisis of a scale that has no historical precedent. According to the United Nations, by 2025, 2/3 of the world's population will face water stress. The numbers are abstract. The landscapes are not. The Aral Sea was once the fourth largest lake in the world, a vibrant inland sea supporting tens of thousands of lives. It has lost 90% of its volume since 1960. The cause was Soviet-era irrigation diversion. The water of the Syr Darya and Amu Darya rivers was taken to grow cotton in a desert. One of the largest environmental disasters in human history, accomplished in less than a lifetime. The Colorado River, which once ran to the sea, now runs dry before it reaches its mouth for most of the year. Its delta is a memory in the mud. The rivers are dying, and the gods are already dead. Or so we thought. The connection between the death of water theology and the death of water is not merely metaphorical. It is a relationship documented by evidence. Anthropologists and environmental historians have shown that communities maintaining living water theologies consistently demonstrate more sustainable water management. Where the river is understood as a person, not a resource, the rules of engagement change. You do not maximize extraction from a person. You negotiate. You offer reciprocity. You consider its health as you would a relative's. This is the foundation of the most significant development in water governance in a generation. The legal personhood movement for rivers. The Wanganui River in New Zealand is now a legal person, Te Awa Tupua, an indivisible and living whole. The Ganges and Yamuna in India were granted similar status by a high court in 2017. The Atrato River in Colombia, whose rights were affirmed in 2016 to protect it from illegal mining. The Magpie River in Quebec, granted legal personhood by the Innu Council and local municipality in 2021. These laws are not identical to the old theologies. They speak in the language of legal standing, guardianship, and fiduciary duty, not of naiads or river mothers. But they share the essential structural feature. They treat the river as a subject rather than an object, as a being with interests rather than a resource with uses. The goddess is returning, but in the language of law. And where the theology remains alive, it has become the language of resistance. The communities most actively maintaining water theology are also the communities most actively resisting water privatization. The Cochabamba water war was not just a protest against price hikes. It was a defense of a cosmological principle. For the indigenous Quechua and Aymara communities at its heart, water could not be owned by a corporation like Bechtel. It was a commons, animated by spirit. At Standing Rock, the rallying cry was, Emni Wikoni, water is life. This was not a slogan. It was the core of a legal and moral argument. The Dakota Access Pipeline threatened the Missouri River. To threaten the river was to threaten the people, because they are the same. The theology is not dead. It is the resistance. And so the documentary ends where it began, with water. The oldest question in human spiritual history is not who made the universe or what happens after death. It is this: what is the river? For 10,000 years, across every culture on earth, the answer was the same. The river is a mother. The river is a goddess. The river is alive. We replace that answer with a different one. The river is a resource. The river is infrastructure. The river is a commodity. And we are now learning what the old answer was protecting. It was protecting the minimum flows. It was protecting the purity of the springs. It was protecting the idea that the water did not belong to us. We belong to it. Every civilization that made water sacred built institutions to protect it. The question the dying rivers are asking us right now is whether we can find our way back to something we chose to forget. or whether the forgetting is the last thing we ever do.